Good morning, everyone. If you could come and take your seats. Good morning, good morning. My name is Mindy Smith. I am the director of the Office of Church Engagement here at Whitworth University. And if you have not heard it yet, just please hear us say warm welcome to you all that have come from all over the country to be here. We are so grateful for this gathering and for the opportunity to learn together. So thank you so much for being here. It's my privilege this morning to be able to introduce our speakers who will have a conversation together. And so we're going to begin this morning with Dr. Beth Allison Barr, who she has received her PhD from the University of North Carolina, and she currently serves as the James Vanderman Professor of History at Baylor University. Dr. Barr is the author of several books, most noteworthy of which is her best-selling work, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. Amen. In this book, she challenges the traditional views on women's roles in the church and society by exploring the historical roots of patriarchy in Christianity. Dr. Barr is a public advocate for women in the church, addressing complex and sometimes controversial topics with a blend of historical insight, personal conviction, and deep compassion. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Malcolm Foley. He received his PhD from Baylor University and currently serves as special advisor to the president for equity and campus engagement at Baylor University. Dr. Foley is a historian, public theologian, and advocate for racial justice, with a particular focus on the history of lynching and racial violence in the United States. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Foley is also active in ministry and advocacy, frequently speaking about racial reconciliation and justice, particularly within Christian communities. He is committed to bridging the gap between the academy and the church, using historical knowledge to inspire change in present-day conversation around race and equity. In his current role at Baylor, Dr. Foley facilitates engagement and interaction with and among the many diverse members of our community and work collaboratively to develop initiatives designed to foster a welcoming and inclusive campus for all. Would you all join me in welcoming our speakers this morning?
Thank you. It's a joy for us to be here today. Malcolm and I have known each other for quite some time, and it's a lot of fun for me to get to be speaking with him. This is the second time that we've spoken publicly together. So I think what we're going to do is we are both going to present problems of liberation within the Christian university. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some solutions to those problems. So I took the card to go first, and we'll let Malcolm follow me. So I just want to start. Well, first of all, I want to say I really appreciated Jamie's lecture last night, and I just want y'all to know that if he thought talking about humanism in the Christian world was controversial, just think about talking about patriarchy. And so anyway, I have lots of comments about that. But I want to do a little thought experiment with y'all today. And I want you to pretend that you are a young Christian woman headed off to university for the first time. And I want you to think about how you had grown up all your life, from as long as you could remember, believing that God had called you to be a pastor. And the church that you grew up in affirmed this, your family affirmed this, and you were so excited to go to a Christian university that you believed was going to launch your ministry that God was calling you to do. And yet you get to your university, and your very first semester there, when you get involved in student life and you get involved in Bible studies, including one in your dormitory, and as you all go sit around and tell what you want to do with your life. And you share the joy of God calling you to ministry. And the response that you get from your peers is, God doesn't call women to preach. I think maybe you got it wrong. This story, like all the ones I'm going to tell you in our thought experiment, happened at my university, Baylor University. A student just told me this story actually last week. Just imagine, as we continue on with this young woman at a college university, that she begins talking with her friends about what professors to take, and she learns about this female Bible teacher who she's so excited and decides that she's going to sign up for her class, and she gets into it, which she was really excited about too because she's a freshman and often it's hard to get into upper level classes. But she got into this class, and then she starts telling her friends about this professor that she's going to be taking the next semester. And she finds out that actually her male friends aren't allowed to take this professor because at this university, women teaching Bible, female scholars, are only allowed to teach other women. This happened at Cedarville University. As this student progresses in her studies, she finds a depressing consistency when she gets into her religion and philosophy and history and even literature classes. And she looks over the syllabus and she finds that women do not appear very often at all. That often the books that are assigned are primarily white males, and she finds very little of the writers that she had known, and even the scholars that she had become aware of before she came to college, cited. That actually works at almost any Christian college and university. I'm going to give you some stats later on it. It also works at actually state universities and public. This is actually a problem throughout the U.S. Let's say that you find one class, though, where this is different, and it's taught by a female professor. And not only does she have women on her syllabus, but she actually quotes one of your favorite evangelical speakers who's been speaking out on race and then confronting the church. And you've heard him speak before, and he is such a great pastor, and his name is Jamar Tisby. And then you find out that this female professor loses her job because she quoted him. This happened at Taylor University. Then you learn about a professor, a male professor, who teaches classes on women in ministry. And you're like, wow, and you're so excited, and so you sign up for his classes. And then you get in his classes, and you find that he makes comments to you that seem weird. And comments about your clothing or your body. And it makes you really uncomfortable. And then you start talking with other women, and you find out that this is a problem. And that all the female students who've had him know this. And they actually tell other students not to take him. And then you find out that he gets fired because of the escalation of these things that he's been doing for years. And you found out that he'd worked at a previous Christian university who knew this and passed him on silently to another one. I can say the name in this one because it's very public. His name is John Stackhouse. And this happened with Crandall University in Canada, and he was quietly dismissed from Regent University and went to Crandall. As this student progresses, one night she's studying late at the library, and she's walking back to her dorm, and her campus has not invested in police call boxes and lights to provide more safety and awareness, even though many had called for this university to do so. And as she's walking across campus, she does not get safely home to her dorm. She is sexually assaulted. And when her friends convince her to go and tell what has happened to her, and the responses that she get can really be summed up in Kelly Carter Jackson's question, what did you do that made someone rape you? It's essentially the response that she gets as she was asked what she was wearing and if she'd been drinking and if she had been at a place where maybe she shouldn't have been. And not only that, but as she struggles with the burden of having had this traumatic experience, and she goes to one of her professors and asks for an extension, and the professor says, no, you let him take your body, don't let him take your grade. This happened at Liberty University. And finally, after all of this, you make it to graduation. Your ideas, your joy, your excitement about the future has been modified, to say the least, from when you entered this Christian space. But you've made it to graduation, and you've worked hard for your degree. And as you're sitting there, the commencement speaker who stands up says, specifically to the women, it's great that you got a degree, but really you should be most excited about not using that degree and fulfilling your calling as a wife and mom. This is what Harrison Butker said last year at the commencement for Benedictine College in Kansas. I just want you to think about, what are the experiences of women at Christian colleges and universities? Universities that proclaim that women are made in the image of God, just like the men. But when it comes to the treatment of women in these spaces, it does not reflect that. Are women treated as humans in your schools, in your classrooms, by your administrators? Or like this student who I just walked through, are they treated as something less? And I'm going to stop there and leave that problem and turn to Malcolm for another.
Wonderful. I want to frame another set of problems. And this one I want to draw a little bit cosmically. So Paul tells us in Ephesians 6 that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the spiritual forces of darkness. Jesus tells us in Matthew 6 that we cannot serve two masters. We will either hate one and love the other, or we'll be devoted to one and despise the other. And we could think of a number of different idols that Jesus might name in that moment. But it's interesting that he says that you cannot serve both God and mammon, or money, riches. I think as that was true in the first century, it is also true now. And the primary way that mammon shows up in our world today is through, and this is and Jamie referred to late capitalism in a number of ways last night. I want to describe our political economy with three words: that it is neoliberal, that it is racialized, and that it is financialized. And those three things shape a number of our assumptions about ourselves and about one another. So I'm just going to go briefly through each of those three. First of all, the neoliberal element. The two things that I think it's most important for us to understand about neoliberal capitalism is that what it does is it frames human beings as fundamentally competitive, and it atomizes us as fundamentally individuals. If everyone that I come into contact with is somebody that I'm supposed to compete with, and this is part of the culture of a number of our institutions of higher education, everybody I come into everyone I come into contact with is a competitor. That is an extremely tiring way. It's an extremely tiring way to live. If I'm being constantly told by every situation that I'm in that fundamentally the way that I operate is as an individual, that's a profoundly isolating way for me to live. Bruce Rogers Vaughan, a pastoral psychologist, frames the life that we live under neoliberal capitalism as a new order of suffering, as what he calls third-order suffering. So first-order suffering is the suffering that we can't avoid. It's just endemic to the human experience. We're thinking about like human pain. We're thinking about death. We're thinking about natural disasters. These things that we can't do anything about, but these things this kind of suffering that all of us endure. Second-order suffering is that suffering that has a root that we can point at. So we're thinking about murder, we're thinking about war, we're thinking about sexual assault, we're thinking about those kinds of things, the evil that we suffer at the hands of other human beings. But there's another kind of suffering that a lot of us are also suffering under right now, and we can't really name what it is. Everybody's feeling it. We're like, why is there such an uptick in mental illness and a lot of us are just depressed and we don't know why. A lot of people are addicted to a number of different things. It's so disparate. We can't name the fog. One of the things that Vaughan argues is that it's because of our political economy. It's because of the way that we're encouraged to think about ourselves and our goods. And so let's say I lose my job, the first place that I'm going to go is what did I do? Did I not work hard enough? Did I treat somebody wrong? But the only place that we can go essentially to explain our circumstances is ourselves, because that's the way that we're encouraged to by our economy. If I'm poor, it's because I didn't work hard enough. When we look out at the poor, we think, well, look, we're in a land of opportunity. The only reason you're in that position is because of something about you. All of these are the assumptions of our economy. And they create a new, in some ways, a new kind of suffering. It even affects the way that that patriarchy instantiates itself in this world now. Now it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult for us to organize and form kind of communal identity. You're on your own, as a man or as a woman. You're on your own in your suffering. It shapes the way that, and I'll talk about the racialized element of this in a second, but it shapes even what we see as anti-racism in the world. It's essentially become a cottage industry where people can essentially make people can essentially make money off of this industry, and what's going on and in many cases, it's a capitalizing on a particular kind of identity politics, where the goal is. Adolf Reed has this example where if I'm noticing that the top 1%, which owns 80 to 90% of the wealth in the world, if I see that's majority white, if I can just get the proper amount of representation of black people in the top, that's justice. That's not justice. Justice is everybody having what they need to function and survive. It's not just me wanting black people to also be in the position of domination. We'll get to the racialized element in a minute. It's the neoliberal point. Second is financialized capitalism. So one of the other elements of our economy is that when we look at essentially what drives it, it's becoming more and more depersonalized. We're encouraged to think of our economy as just this thing that's out there, and largely it's because the financial industry, and I say this as somebody who was a religious studies and finance double major, which is an interesting combination. But so much of the world's economy is driven by essentially these complex financial instruments that you have to dig layers down before you get to something that you can actually touch. Trillions of dollars of essentially betting. But one of the things that also does to us is it keeps us from seeing the flow of resources as a fundamentally human endeavor. And third, the racialized element. Race fundamentally does three things, and this is what I argue in my book that's coming out in February, The Anti-Greed Gospel. Race does three things. It lies, it steals, and it kills. That's fundamentally, historically, what the purpose of that category is. Race is created specifically to justify systems of economic exploitation. Race, the function of race is to place you into a particular category that allows me to treat you as an exploitable thing. And so when we look at particularly our political economy, one of the things that we have to deeply resist is the desire to see one another as exploitable things. I'll give you one last thing to frame kind of the problem in terms of this world that we live in. I think that race is part of what I like to call a demonic cycle of self-interest. It begins with our desire to exploit and dominate each other. But we don't like to think about ourselves in terms of wanting to exploit and dominate one another. And nobody wants to be in the position of being exploited or dominated. And so those who seek to exploit and dominate then use violence in order to enforce that exploitation and domination. But we also, as human beings, don't get up in the morning and think, I'm really excited for a day of exploiting, dominating, and killing my neighbor. So we form narratives in order to hide that fact from ourselves. This is the role that race plays. Narratives of race are historically created in order for folks to be able to tell themselves, I'm not exploiting, dominating, and killing my neighbor. I'm doing something that is for their good, or something that the Lord actually intends for them. This is racialized chattel slavery. It's the Portuguese coming to Africa, witnessing chattel slavery, and not thinking, well, these people are black, let's enslave them. It's thinking, we have markets we need to expand. Chattel slavery is a wonderfully cheap source of labor. And then after you get involved, you've got to justify that not only to yourself, but also to the Pope. And so the categories of blackness and whiteness come out of that historical frame. Narratives of civilization and savagery, the narratives of specifically a framing of the heathen in need of being Christianized. Yeah, we're going to make a whole bunch of money off of it, but what this is really about is Christianizing the heathen. These three elements, the neoliberal, financialized, and racialized elements of capitalism, shape a number of our assumptions about ourselves, about one another, and insofar as they are not directly addressed in the profound socializing opportunity that we have in the university, they end up just getting reinscribed over and over and over again. There's our problem.
Well, I think I'm sorry we started off your morning with very sobering thoughts. But I will tell you that working on these problems, we were talking about this last night, and Malcolm has been researching lynching, which is not an uplifting topic, for quite a while. Yeah. And I lately have been significantly involved in understanding the entrenchment of not just patriarchy, but a particular form of patriarchy that uses the Bible to, I would argue, subjugate women, and also to make women invisible in spaces where women's stories are not believed by men, are not heard by men in the leadership, and are covered up. Especially stories of sexual harassment and abuse. And the evidence of this is pouring out in the media right now. And what we know, too, is that this is just the tip of the iceberg on this. And when I entered this space with the Making of Biblical Womanhood, one of the things that I've been privileged to is having women write me from all over the world. And the stories that they share with me are both encouraging and heartbreaking over what they face in Christian spaces. And I think what's so challenging about this too is that in Christian spaces we cover this up with narratives that say that this is how God created women, that I am so glad that you are gifted in this area, but you can't express that gifting in the same ways as your male student, as your male peers, because God put limits on you, that he didn't put limits on men. Just want you to think about how women receive that. Just want you to think about that. I have a couple of solutions to offer you that I want to talk about, although I still want you to think. And I know I'm probably speaking to some people who would disagree with me theologically, and that's okay. But you still have to think through the implications of your theology and how it plays out in the university with your female faculty and with female students. And if we are talking about liberation in the university as well as human flourishing, we have to think about how a theology that argues that God limits women because of their bodies impacts the women in our lives. So I have a couple of stories that I want to tell you, and I'm doing a podcast miniseries for my next book, and I've had the privilege of interviewing women and listening to their stories, especially women who were involved in the push out of ordination by the Southern Baptist Convention in the early 80s. And their stories are tremendous. And one of the continuous themes that I heard from these women who grew up in Southern Baptist churches in the 60s and the 70s and grew up being very involved in everything in their churches, including, if you know anything about the Southern Baptist world, something called GAs, Girls in Action, which was which essentially was preparing women for ministry. And these women's stories are that they never heard in their churches that they couldn't be called in the same ways as men. Over and over, they said, nobody told me I couldn't do this until the early 80s. So don't you just think about that. Southern Baptist churches, nobody told them they couldn't do this until the early 80s. In fact, one woman told me, she said, somebody should have told me that when the preacher was standing up and saying that God is calling you, that what he meant was God is calling the men. Because that's what began to happen to us when we went to go fulfill our missions. One woman who felt called to ministry was trying to get discernment on this issue. And she went to one of her college professors who was a chaplain. And she said, I want to talk to you about chaplaincy because I think God may be calling me into chaplaincy. And she said, I'm not exactly sure what that would take, but that's what I'm thinking about going to seminary. And she actually ended up going to Golden Gate Seminary, which is Southern Baptist Seminary. And this male professor took her aside and sat down with her and said, I think you need to rethink because I don't think God's calling you to that. Because chaplaincy requires ordination, and you can't you should not be ordained because that's outside of God's will. And the shock that she experienced from hearing this, because it wasn't even a ministry for preaching or for pastoring a church, it was to be a chaplain. And yet, the person she went to for mentoring or just simply discernment used that opportunity to tell her that she was wrong in what she thought God was calling her to. Think about that. I heard a story from another woman who was also wanting to go on. She wasn't sure yet if she wanted to go on for a PhD or for ministry. She went to some of her professors who at that time were mostly male, because that's the way the patriarchy of the U.S., and I've said this over and over again, the church argues that patriarchy is a way that we make ourselves different from the world. It isn't. Patriarchy is the way that we look like everyone else, because this has been the story of women's lives. And so she went to one of her Christian male professors and asked him to write for her. And he told her he wouldn't, not because she wasn't a stellar student, but because he didn't think she should go to a seminary. How is this theology impacting our students? It is causing us to intervene and tell them that they are wrong in what the call they feel on God's life. Just think about that. Who are we to tell someone else that God is not calling them to that? Even if your theology is different, does that mean you have the right to tell someone else who is a faithful Christian that they can't go on and serve God in these ways? Is it? One way that I think Christian universities can face this issue is by treating our female students as simply human. And when they come to us with their vocational dreams and their desires and the things that they want to do, that we encourage them, even if we don't think, if we have reservations about, hey, that's actually not my theology, that may not be theirs or their faith tradition. Do you know that there are faith traditions that support women in ministry all the way through? And there are still places out there where I lived with students for 6 years. And I cannot tell you how many of them grew up in spaces where their whole life they saw women preach. And it never occurred to them, I've heard this over and over again, until they got to Baylor. And they were like, I don't know where to go to church because there's no female preachers. And this was a whole new thing for them. How can we treat our female students better? Why don't we stop limiting them in what we think they should do? And let that calling be with them, between them and God. As I said, as someone, my talk here this morning is based upon both the evidence that I showed you earlier and that I'm going to, in my second solution here, I'm going to talk you through some articles. But it's also based on my experience of having lived with undergraduate students for 6 years and having been in the classroom teaching women's history at Christian universities since 2008. And some of the most moving things that students, I still remember when a student came to me and told me that my class was the first, and this was a general history class, it was the first time that she'd ever seen a woman on the syllabus in her classes at Baylor. And I can't tell you how that takes me aback. Because if we believe that women are fully human and fully made in the image of God, and we fully believe in their capability and their scholarship, why aren't we representing them on our syllabi? Why are we not including their voices? With that, let me just give you a couple of articles on this. And these are both from state universities because there's not a lot of Christian universities that are actually exploring this problem. This might be something that I think we should take up. I strongly believe in evidence-based research. So if you're like, my university isn't like this, I know that, it's not. Okay, why don't you go pull everybody's syllabi and look, see what you come up with. In fact, I'm itching to get somebody to do this at Baylor. I want to see. But I think, so these are from two places. One of them is from Worcester Polytechnical Institute, and one of them is from WashU, University in St. Louis, okay? So these are outside of the Christian world, but they are data points on this. And in both of these, you can find these articles. One of them is in higher ed, it's relatively recent. And one of them is in a STEM journal called, and the article's name is Diversity of the Syllabi, Underrepresentation of Female Authors in Course Readings. That's it. And what they found is that despite the fact that female scholars are more than represented in the academic world, and that women's scholarship is increasing, if we think about the publication in journals, et cetera, like that, and their research is increasingly publicly available, that the matching of using that scholarship on syllabi is still significantly less than men. And if you think about in the STEM world, sometimes these numbers are inflated because you're like, oh, well, that article has a woman on it. Oh, she's author number 9. As for first author, females on syllabi is much rarer. So what they found is at the Worcester University, they found that only 1 in 5 of the syllabi included women and minority scholars on the syllabi at a public university, 1 in 5. WashU found that it varied based upon discipline. They found social sciences were much more likely to include women on the syllabi than either the liberal arts or STEM. And in some of the STEM, they found that the readings aside, that women were only about 30%. So 70% were mostly men. And this is overall, so this isn't even counting or differentiating between female professors and male professors, which I think is also important because what we assign conveys to our students who we think is important. And when male professors are mostly assigning only men, you're conveying a message about that. And when you're only assigning people who look like you, you're conveying a message about that. So this isn't calling into account any of those variations. But they found that, and then in other places, some of the best case scenario was that 65% of the assigned readings were only men, which is, a little bit better. So the difference between and I think about this, we think about theology and practice, and the argument is that women are fully equal. Then why is that not reflecting in the curriculum that we teach in our universities? Why is that not reflected in the promotion policies of our female faculty, which we know in Christian, this we actually do have a lot of evidence on, that Christian colleges and universities lag way behind public universities who still have problems in promoting female faculty. Baylor actually, when they've gotten much better because there's been a concerted effort, but Baylor actually had a significant problem with women being promoted to full professors. So what Baylor did is they actually started women writing groups, targeting different groups of professors at different stage along tenure, and giving them permission from the provost that during those designated writing times, they were exempt from meetings, they were exempt from office hours, they were exempt from any other departmental things so that they could sit in a community of other women and work only on their scholarship. Do you know what happened? There's been an explosion of women getting promoted at Baylor, just from taking that one intentional step and recognizing that women face more challenges, more barriers in making it through the tenure progress than male professors do. So I'll stop there for a minute and let Malcolm move into some solutions, but I hope maybe, as big as these problems are in our universities, there are things we can do that will have immediate impact on the students and even the faculty around us. So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. I think it's very important that we draw the problem very starkly because I also think about this as a pastor. Like I want people to understand how dark the situation is so that they can come to a deeper understanding of how great the light of the gospel is.
Yes.
And so as I think about our political economy, there are roughly three things that come to mind in how we can organize our institutions in such a way that resists those exploitative and diminutive elements. One is that, and this is very hard to do. All these things are kind of hard to do. One is for us to consider what it might look like to be institutions that facilitate love. Now, when I say love, a lot of things are going to probably come to your mind. So I have to define what love is. In 1 John 3:16, we're told this is how we know what love is, that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Therefore, we ought to lay down our lives for one another. And then John immediately follows that up by saying, if any of you has material possessions, and you see a brother or sister in need and have no pity on them, how can you say that the love of God is in you? James will say something similar when he talks about works. He talks about when somebody is lacking daily food or clothing. Love, according to the scriptures, is a material care for your neighbor. Fundamentally, it's not about the way that I feel. It's not about me feeling a particular way about you. It's about whether or not I'm invested in your actual material flourishing. This is the way that our love of enemies is defined in Romans 12 when Paul is in many ways, I think, kind of laying out the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount. When he frames the way that we treat when he frames the way that we ought to treat our enemies, he says never seek revenge, but instead always leave room for the Lord's wrath. But when your enemy is hungry, you give him something to eat. Your enemy's thirsty, you give him something to drink. Love is material care for your neighbor. So, what are the ways in which we are socializing our students, our faculty, and our staff to think about one another as human beings to be loved, not commodities to be exploited, not all the other things that our particular political economy will tell us to think about ourselves and one another. When I see another human being, what I'm seeing is a human being that is to be loved. How might we build institutions that drive that deep into the hearts of every person that we have the opportunity to serve? Second, our institutions ought to be deeply embedded in our local communities and also in our local churches. One of the elements of neoliberal capitalism is an erosion of communities. When you are constantly told that you are the only one who can solve your problems, and that isolates you and depresses you and all these kinds of things, and when independence is the goal, as opposed to what Christ calls us to, it's what all these images of the body of Christ, like what these images show us is that what we are called to is a mutual interdependence. That whether or not I flourish is bound up in whether or not you're flourishing. Our institutions often will fall because we think that what's really important is that this institution stays alive.
as opposed to thinking about the fact that this institution ought to be in a life-giving web in its local community, such that when our institutions of higher ed suffer, the people actually in our communities recognize that and come alongside us in those moments, as opposed to thinking, well, they've largely functioned as a large-scale exploiter in our community. I don't really care if they're going through what they're going through. That ought to never be the narrative about any of our Christian institutions of higher education. But the fact of the matter is that for a number of our institutions, they began in either a protective impulse or a diminutive impulse. That they started with kind of Christians wanting to create enclaves to protect themselves from the world. Or these are opportunities for us to raise and disciple folks who are going to go out and take over the world. Neither of those are what Christ has called us to do. Christ has called us to build come and see communities. Communities where we can show people this is what human flourishing looks like. Come on in. When you're compelled by this vision, we then respond, well, this is what the Holy Spirit does. Repent and believe and get on and get in on this too. One of the ways that we can combat a number of these assumptions is by seeking to build come and see communities. But the other thing, and this would be my last thing, and then we can just kind of do a little bit of back and forth for our last 10 minutes. We are encouraged to think of ourselves as either fundamentally producers or fundamentally consumers, and it feels like the better thing would be to be is a producer, or this is the way that the logic of mammon works. You want to be at the top. The gospel calls us to be fundamentally sharers. We are not fundamentally producers. We're not fundamentally consumers. We're fundamentally sharers. In Acts 2. After the Spirit descends on the people of God, there are 4 things that shape the people of God. It's that we are devoted to the apostles' teaching, we are devoted to prayer, we're devoted to the breaking of bread, eating together, and the fellowship, koinonia, which is the sharing of goods. It is one of the primary witnesses of the Christian community is actually its economic witness. Because we are fundamentally sharers. We're fundamentally people who, when we see people in need, our response is, what is it that the Lord has given me in order to meet this need? And what is it that the Lord has blessed you with that actually meets my need? That's what solidarity is. And we're in a culture and an economy that specifically discourages solidarity. And we tend to know institutions by what they incentivize and what they penalize. So what might it look like for us to build institutions that incentivize solidarity? What might it look like for us to build a curriculum that incentivizes solidarity? So, for example, when we think about the classroom setting, we're often thinking about a setting where individual assessment is what matters. Well, what's that going to breed? It's going to breed people who think that what they do as an individual is what matters. What might it look like creatively for you to create a class where there is no assessment that you can point to that reduces to individual assessment? What might it look like if you thought about creating a class where everything that people are assessed where everything that people are assessed on required collaboration, assignments that were impossible to complete alone, but necessarily required working with others? By incentivizing that framework, what you're also doing is you're telling your students, you individually are not the one who fundamentally matters. You do matter, obviously. But what you're told by the world is that you're all that matters. What might it mean for us to find these opportunities to drill into ourselves and one another, that the way for me to flourish is for us to flourish? That when you suffer, I'm actually suffering. And that when you do well, I do well as well. It cuts against, we love Augustine when he quotes the wisdom of Ben Ben Sirach or Ecclesiasticus and saying that pride is the beginning of sin. I think greed is the most fundamental sin. The desire to accumulate for oneself. And one of the primary ways in which we fight that is through solidarity. Greed and envy have a very similar root, and they are both sins that are deeply endemic to our society. And one of the primary ways that we fight them is through solidarity, recognizing that, especially us as Christians, we are not called primarily to be producers, we're not called primarily to be consumers, we are called primarily to be sharers.
I was thinking, Malcolm, as you were talking, one historical thing that we can point to with overwhelming evidence over and over again is that the moments in church history that we see crackdowns on women in ministry come at times when the rules are changing that regard things like how we're paying people. And when it comes to matters of authority, leadership, and money that goes along with this. In fact, as a medievalist, I can tell you in the Central Middle Ages that we see the rules about ordination change, actually, and they become connected to the sacrament at the altar. And they also come connected to benefices, which if you are ordained as a priest, you are supposed to receive a benefice, which is this economic property. And it's not at all surprising to me that as the rules are changing across this Central Middle Ages, that this is when we see women being written out of ordination. I will tell you as a historian that women served in ordained roles, what we would consider to be ordained roles, for the first 1,200 years of Christianity. If you don't believe me, you can go read Gary Macy's really fantastic book on the hidden history of women's ordination. Most recently, the most recent crackdown that we know of happened to women in the US, and actually also in the Western world. We see a similar thing going on like in the UK, et cetera, in the 70s and 80s. And this is a time when more women, because the US had begun to break down because of legal challenges to education systems that were keeping women out. Yep. And now women were now being able to enter into educational spaces. And they were also able to do things like take out credit cards in their own name without having to have, my students are always overwhelmed to realize that women in the US were discriminated against in being able to take out credit in their own name, buy houses, buy cars without having male co-signers. And this actually took legal action to say that it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex for giving credit for women. My students, I tell them that Barbie got her dream house before women in the US could own houses. Which I've become more of a Barbie fan over time, I have to tell you. But anyway, so back to my point is that I think we've thought about ministry calling as a limited commodity, and that if women move into it, then there's less for men. And I've actually heard it articulated this way. In fact, in one of the interviews, a woman told her story, and she said this was exactly what a man actually told her when she asked him point blank, will you support women in ministry? And he said, I don't think I can do that because it will affect my ministry. And this is thinking about, if we think about hoarding of resources, how does that apply to the rules that we have instated in our churches on women serving? Have you seen the 2023 Christianity Today article by Jen Wilkin, which is highlighting the disparity of women's pay in churches? And it found that 83% of female leaders in churches, which means that they were serving in ministry roles that were critical to the church, were either unpaid or volunteer status. I mean, this is mind-blowing to me. So not only do we tell women that they can't be pastors, but then we don't pay them for the work that they are doing. What does that say about why we aren't letting women into these? Is it really theology, y'all? Or is it, does it have something to do with how we have articulated resources within the church and even within our academic spaces? You know, we still have this idea that if a woman moves into this position, it means a man can't be there. Is that a Christian way to think? I'll let Malcolm.
Brothers and sisters, I think it's important for us to remember that all of these things that we've narrated, these are things that if we are to deal with them, we have to deal with them together.
Yes.
Because they implicate all of us. And when our brothers and sisters suffer, we suffer. And we can either and so I'm thankful for the opportunity. I'm thankful for the opportunity that we have to discuss these things. We invite questions, yeah, thank you all very much.
I hope you all had your coffee before you came in here.
Yeah, let's keep the conversation going. As with last night, maybe just introduce your name and your institution. And yeah, we've got a good half an hour to converse.
Glenn Sanders. Mic problems again. King University. I'm curious about the creation of spaces for the development of conscience, because it strikes me that while we do that work together, that's one of the fundamental things we have to do with students. Beth, the example you gave of the peers who denigrated a young woman's calling, and the constant inability of many simply not to respect a person's conscience, the inability of people to recognize the kind of exploitation you've described, Malcolm. How do we create spaces, what kinds of spaces, where conscience can grow in a Christian way?
I think one of the things that our political economy does is it desensitizes us to one another. And so one of the things that we need to do is resensitize ourselves and the folks whom we serve to exploitation and violence. That sounds extreme. But I want us to really sharply see the kind of harm that we cause to one another. So this is what I got from my lynching research. It was just a few years of just me staring at what is some of the darkest things that human beings have ever done to one another in this country's history. And when I narrate that for students, a lot of people's first reaction is, I've never heard this before. My understanding of the history of race in America is basically just this upward trend. I mean, yeah, there was slavery, but then there was Jim Crow, and then the Civil Rights Movement, and now we're all good. And what it is, but that history is a history of mutation, not of development or progress. There's progress in the sense that there are the material circumstances of many that kind of change over the course of that time. But when we look at especially the way that poverty looks in this country, it is unconscionable. It is unconscionable that millions of children live in this country on the equivalent of $2 a day. That just ought to be unconscionable. but we prefer narratives of progress to narratives of the deep darkness that we submit one another to. And so part of it is not mincing words about those things, but then also building in folks this understanding that what ought to be kind of fundamental to Christian education is a recognition of our responsibility to one another. And that's hard. Like, it's hard to instill when you're told that you're the one who matters and you're at this school to get a particular job or whatever folks are told. Like, it's difficult to kind of break that and be like, actually, what's really most important for you as a person is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And nobody's going to know. And as John will say in 1 John 4. You can't say that you love God who you never seen. You don't love your brother who you can see. And so part of it is getting students to see each other in a society where they're only encouraged to look at themselves.
Yeah. While Malcolm was talking, I was thinking about, as Christians, if we look and see what Jesus was doing, Jesus was listening to people and talking to people who weren't like him. And one of the stories that I've used in talks that I've given and also with individuals is the story of Hagar, and how the fact that this woman, this enslaved person, young child, young teenager, woman of color, who was sexually assaulted and beaten and thrown out by the people who God was calling to start his nation, I hate to use the word nation right now, but nonetheless, the very beginning. And God comes to her and promises her pretty much the same thing that he promised Abraham, that he would make her descendants be a great nation. And she names God. Did you know she's the first person who names God? And she names God the God who sees. The story of the Bible is the story of God seeing women. It's in there. God seeing the people that our modern churches don't anymore. And if we want to create spaces where students learn to see people, and to see them with that, I grew up in the 80s, so Amy Grant, my father's eyes. We want to have my father's eyes, right? We have to practice seeing people and listening to them. And I think about my friend Jamar Tisby, and y'all, I've known Jamar for a long time, and he is one of the most faithful Christians that I know. He's so firm in his faith, and it's shocking to me that Christian spaces that invited him, they're like, oh, we want to hear you. But then when he said something that made him uncomfortable, suddenly, oh no, we don't want to hear you anymore. We invited you in to listen, but you didn't say what we wanted you to say, so now you're not welcome here anymore. That's what we told him. And where do you find Jesus doing that? We've got to create Christian spaces where we see and we hear people, even when we don't like what they are telling us.
Thanks. Great talks, both. Lots to chew on. I'm Jeff Bilbro. I wanted to pick up on something you both mentioned and ask if you could explore more in detail how we might imagine our institutions build structures of solidarity that are non-exploitative. So Beth, you talked about sometimes women work at churches and are unpaid, right? That's exploitative. And yet, as faculty members at Christian institutions, we have limited pots for professional development we're competing for. We want more salary. We want more individual goods, right? So we are in this competitive, scarce resource context, and then, of course, that's how our institutions operate more broadly. At my previous institution, I definitely felt this sense of spiritual abuse sometimes. Like, oh, you're going to take a cut this year, but because you love God and it's a mission, that's a good thing. And yet I know that, a lot of our institutions were built sometimes, people didn't have money, but they rolled up their sleeves and built buildings, or they gave sacrificially. They had this sense of common purpose. So how can we as a church kind of recapture institutions of solidarity where people are sacrificing and really giving of themselves in a way that's not exploitative, right? So that's, to me, is the big challenge with the Christian institutions, that too often we're just like our secular counterparts, and any hints that could be redemptive, could be Christian, are exploitative.
Yeah, I'm going to let Malcolm start with this one for sure.
Oh, that was
And then I'll pull in.
Sure, yeah, and this is, I always hesitate to say this because there are some spaces where I'm just gonna say it. So I don't think that, all right, I'll just say it. I don't think that Christian institutions besides the church exist in a comprehensive way. I think that in order for you to function as a university or as a business or whatever, you have to do unchristlike things. Wait, say that again. For you to be able to survive as an institution that is not the church, you have to do unchristlike things. I think that for you to operate as a university in this country, I think that for you to stay alive, sometimes, actually no, all the time, for you to stay alive, there are some things. So I think that when we get into kind of hiring practices and some other things at that level, what we're dealing with, even insofar as when we tinker with equity, what we are really tinkering with are just kind of varying levels of exploitation. So everybody's just exploited equitably. I think that's what it comes down to a lot of the time. So I think there are always ways in which we ought to be seeking reform insofar as we're in these spaces. But I also want us to be sober. I also want us to be sober about what our expectations are of our institutions. We ought to, I think, constantly be fighting for our Christian institutions to be more Christian. But that is going to be, until Jesus comes back, that's going to be an eternal journey. Now, with that, there are some ways that I think we can seek that. One is through just organizing folks. So one of this is getting faculty, staff, and students together in naming and resisting injustice. So Martin Luther King has there are four steps to nonviolent direct action. It begins with the recognition of an injustice. So first you've got to name, like, what is the injustice that's taking place. The second step is negotiation. So you go to those who are in power and you say, I recognize that this injustice exists. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about it? If you come up against an institution that then refuses, because the other thing about this is that compromise is necessarily going to take place when you go into those kinds of negotiations. So understand that that's going to happen. But if you come up against an institution that then refuses to listen, well, the next step is self-purification. So the next step is you gathering with those folks and recognizing, okay, this is gonna have to be the kind of people that we're gonna be that we're going to have to be in order for us to move to this next step, which is creative, nonviolent direct action. The thing about, especially when I look out at some protests going on in higher ed, kind of across the country and stuff, a lot of people skip straight to the protest march stage, and don't do any of the other steps in between. And that's what leads to, disaster. When people haven't done the work, particularly in thinking about nonviolent direct action, when people haven't done the work of actually training for that kind of work, violence is really, really easy. Like, violence is just really, really easy to get into. And if you've not gathered as a people to recognize, okay, this is what we actually want, and this is what we're going to organize for. If that doesn't happen, it's very difficult to actually meet those goals. So one thing that I would point folks to is, well, like, gather, especially faculty, staff, and students, but often institutions will more easily listen to students than they will to faculty and staff.
Yes.
So it's just a fact of the way that I know about this at Baylor. There are things that when the board hears it, or when the administration kind of hears it from students, they're like, oh, yeah, this is a problem. So my temper my pessimism with these practical things that we can do, because insofar as we're embedded in these systems, these are things that we have to do.
As again, I said, I believe in evidence-based research, which I hope we all do. And if the narratives we often have at our Christian universities is that we do treat people well and that we're not exploiting some people more than others. And I'm like, okay, prove it to me.
Yeah, prove it.
Go do a study, do a self study that actually uses the methodology that you should to figure out, are women, what is the salary comparison between women and men in the same types of jobs? What is it? What's the disparity there? And so again, we cannot solve problems until we know precisely what those problems are. And this is something that, institutions, I was in the dean's office, I was in the graduate school as an associate dean for 4.5 years. Institutions love gathering this type of data, where we can measure and we can look at promotions across. This is what Baylor did. They looked across and they found out that women were not going up. And so they were like, okay, we've got to do something targeted to get women to go up. And then they looked at salaries and they found out that, oh yeah, there was a big pay gap. And I'm going to throw in something else here that I've learned about pay gap at Christian universities. Did you know that because men can be ordained and that the IRS recognizes them working at a Christian institution, that they get the clergy tax exemption? But women who can't be ordained by your institutions aren't getting that. Which means that there is a significant pay gap that even if I saw some faces here, I may have just gotten myself in trouble. But that means that if your salary is the same, if you're on paper, look, they're all getting paid the same. How many of your male faculty are getting that tax exemption? And you're not letting your female faculty get it because you're not allowing them to be ordained. I want you to think about that. Universities need to see the problems, and so we need to gather the evidence and see how it actually impacts them. And then we can gather together and look at that evidence and try to figure out how to more equitably exploit everyone at the same level instead of. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but yeah.
Jessica, I saw your face as I was speaking. Let's have a conversation. and then what? Yeah, we could go back.
I'm really floored by this, maybe because I am such an idealist. I love
Yeah.
church. I love the kingdom that Jesus is bringing us towards.
Me too.
So the work that I'm doing, I believe in Christian institutions.
Yeah.
I love looking back and thinking about those people who were building
Yeah.
this as a way to educate the church, as a way to give them the resources to be disciples. That's what I hope we're all doing.
Yeah, I don't think I even want to say that when Jesus comes, our institutions will be Christian. In the, in the sense that, you know, and this is something I'm thinking through too. You know, when the Lord returns, what's going to last? I just preached on this past Sunday, Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 to 23, where Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many of you will come to me and say, 'Did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not build Christian universities in your name? Did we not work miracles in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name?' All awesome things." To which Jesus will respond to some of them and say, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of iniquity." There is a part of us, I think all of us, that thinks, "I just want to do big things for Jesus." And Jesus is like, that's not what I'm concerned with. I'm not concerned with you doing big things for me. I'm concerned with you being united to me. And so there is, and so I think I'm in the senior administration of a Christian university. I love Christian, like it's great. We're doing great. There are good things that we're supposed to do. All these things that in talking about kind of building institutions of love, building institutions that resist the impulses of domination and exploitation that shape the rest of the world. Like these are things that we need to do. But as I think of what's actually going to actually last, I'm sober about that. But I recognize that in every space that the Christian finds themselves, the first question that they ask is, how do I live in union with Christ in this space, given what the Lord has given me? And it goes back to the sharing thing. I mean, I fundamentally see myself as a sharer, because that's what Christ exemplifies in his incarnation. He takes on flesh. It's framed for us as a gift, but it's a gift that's meant for the purpose of sharing. He takes on flesh in order. Well, the way that Athanasius and others say it is that the Son of God became man so that man might become God. That he takes on flesh to bring us up to where he is, and that's the nature of the sharing that we ought to be, that our institutions ought to be emblematic of. It's just really hard. It's just hard to do, but we're called to do it.
I think I think Malcolm, we just have to recognize that we make compromises, and we need to be aware of what those compromises are, and try to make those compromises as equitable and as Christ-like as possible. And so I think it's more just the awareness.
And there's going to always be more. There's always going to be more to do.
Yeah.
I think this will echo some of that. I'm Eric Gregory. I teach at Princeton University, so greetings from the belly of the beast of the neoliberal university with a $40 billion endowment.
That's so much money. That's just so much. Like we just need to consider that. That's so much money. Anyway, go ahead.
But most of it is targeted and limited, so it's not a rainy day fund, as our president always says. I think this is an observation, but it's an invitation it builds on this question of maybe pessimism. And it was something Malcolm said, and also Beth. You invoked the narrative of progress. And so ideas of moral progress, let's just say, were central to the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
Right? And it's what Augustinians like me always poke fun at, right? But this is an amateur sociological observation, okay, emboldened by Jamie's talk. Mm-hmm. Ideas of moral progress have largely vanished at most secular research universities. Not even my moralized Princeton undergraduates, who are deep in the throes of like sweaty protest right now, they don't believe the arc of the universe bends towards justice. Okay? And part of it is because we academics are really good at critique.
Yeah.
Right? And we've been teaching them the weight of systemic injustice.
Yeah.
And we've been teaching them the limits of human agency in a world threatened by patriarchy, racism. So much so that, like, we read Baldwin last week, and my students just thought he was just so fabulously optimistic about America.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or when I assigned them Reinhold Niebuhr, it's like ho-hum.
Yeah.
Like, they believe in original sin, right? But all they have is law and no gospel.
Yeah.
So I've never had utopian idealists. It's Princeton. They're like reformers, reduce suffering. You're not going to change the world. But they used to have a sense of being agents of social change.
Yeah.
Right? That's what our university, that's what our motto is, right? It used to be in the service of the nation, then it was in the service of all nations, and now it's in the service of humanity. Like, that's a whole other parable of, like, where higher education has gone. But there's a kind of nihilism, right? And they love black pessimism, and they love critique, right? Which is proliferated like kudzu, right? So I guess my question is, how does this psychological description of a certain class of elite students, which it might be a form of guilty indulgence that allows them to be lazy and then just take a job with, the vast majority of my students, say, I'm going to just make a lot of money and give some of it away. So in the context of loss of trust, the loss of a narrative of progress, what role is there for critique? Is it because in your settings, these Christian students still have an idealistic image of historical progress, and that in Christian settings, we haven't encountered the hermeneutic of suspicion? But it just seems like that, I just worry sometimes, because we academics are so good at it, that's what gets you tenure in some ways, is like, but this is almost a pedagogy question and a psychological question about, like, I have a very romantic image of Christian colleges, as you'll hear when Jonathan and I kind of imagine exchanging what it would be like to teach. But is this true of a kind of the average Christian college student, that they also have this, like, heavy sense of the burdens of history being so stained? Or, is there still an optimistic millennial dispensationalism at work in some of their, Pelagian hopes?
So I'll start, because I've been in the classroom for a really long time, and I lived with these students, these undergrads. Baylor's students are still, I forget what the statistics are on them now, that with predominantly from faith backgrounds. What's this? Yeah, but what's the statistic?
Christian.
It's like for
Baptist and Catholic are our top two.
Yeah, okay, that's still the same. So it used to be roughly 35% Baptist, similar for Catholic, and then a lot of other faith traditions mixed in. And I would say that a significant portion of the students that I've interacted with are still fairly optimistic. And a lot of them do come from very sheltered environments. Like, I can think about, like, my daughter, for example, who's 14, and she's been, our church is very economically challenged, and so her youth group friends come from homes that have challenges that all the hardest things are what her friends are facing. And she recently went to a youth group of one of her friends, and she just came home and she was just like, Mom, they have no idea of what people live through every day. And I think we shelter our students so much so. I mean, I remember my husband and I, when our very first, the church he eventually got fired from, but his very first year there, he did what he always did. He's a social worker. And he did what he always did, is he started getting us involved, the youth group involved with mission organizations in town to go work with especially low-income housing things, and parents got all upset with him and said that he was punishing the kids by making them do service projects. I mean, and I'm still floored by this. And I remember when we were taking them to go, we did the thing called King's Club on Saturday morning, where you just went and played with kids at the low-income apartment complex. We've been doing this for years. We've been taking in fact, my son's doing it now in college because he's been doing it all of his life. And the parents, they came to us and they wanted us to know what safety precautions we had put into place and if it was safe to wear jewelry and stuff. And I just remember just being like floored because there was no experience in encountering this. It was all theoretical to them. And a lot of the students that we get a lot of the students that I've lived with who come from these higher economic Christian spaces that have been going to these mega churches where their camps cost more to go to than, the monthly salaries of the people at our church. I'm talking about all together when you take the whole group. That they do have a lot of optimism about, and in fact, I mean, at Baylor too, I wonder too, because we actually have very few protests on campus and sort of thing, and I think part of it is maybe this lack of awareness of this experience, and
this
it's
is what
during,
racial, it's what racial and economic segregation do.
Yes, it's the bubble,
Yeah.
and so so they are learning, and I'm sorry to say that my classroom is one of the spaces that I feel like every class, I'm sorry we're ending on this heavy note. We just talked through a book called The Murder of Regula, Sarah Pomeroy's really fantastic book on this first case of domestic abuse, and not first case of it, but it was this woman who was murdered by her husband, and it's documented, and it brings up all of these things of systemic patriarchy. And I mean, a lot of my students, they had never had those discussions before. So I will say that I still see a lot of optimism because they haven't been taught differently. They haven't seen things differently. And so in my classroom, part of it is trying to help them see these things, see these challenging things, but also realize that there are things they can do about it so that they don't, I don't ever want students, I don't want to deconstruct their lives where they can't build them back up. And so that's what I think in the classroom is we always have to give them the tools to build things back up. So that wasn't really a short answer.
I know our time is almost up. So can I do 1 minute? Great. I take a Cornell West line that I'm hopeful, not optimistic. And for me, and this is one of the advantages of any institution that claims to be Christian, is that any institution that claims to be Christian also claims to point to something other than itself. And it means that we point to our Savior, and we point to the people that our Savior has shaped and formed, because there is an institution against which the gates of hell cannot and will not prevail. And we know that, like Christians know that to be true. And so when we think about hope, there are a number of different places for us to falsely place our hope, for us to falsely place our optimism or whatever. But we have an opportunity. I think we have an opportunity to point in a way that others can't see through the fog. We have something to point to that clears that fog.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're stopping now because time is limited. But yeah, join me in thanking Malcolm and Beth. So we got a lunch break now. Encourage you again to join us in the Crow's Nest over in the hub for lunch and to keep the conversation going. The next thing on the schedule, as you'll see, is back here at 1:30. Malcolm, will you pray for us? Put you on the spot. Yeah.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that you've allowed us to gather together in your name. Lord, we pray that you would bless this food that we're about to eat, and Lord, that you would bless the conversations that might follow.
Lord, we thank you for the many gifts that you continue to pour out on us in your grace and your mercy. And we pray these things in the name of your Son and by the power of your Spirit. Amen.
Okay, I guess we'll get started. Go ahead and grab a seat, and we'll get going with our next session. So I'm Nathan King. I teach here in Whitworth's philosophy department, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for this afternoon's conversation. Our own Derek Taylor will be doing some moderating and taking Q&A in a bit, but for now, please introduce Jonathan Tran and Eric Gregory. Both of this afternoon's speakers have CVs of the sort that we could just sort of spend the whole hour reading, but we also want to hear from them, so I'll just do a brief introduction. So Jonathan Tran earned his PhD from Duke University. He's currently Associate Dean for Faculty in the Honors College and Professor of Theology of Great Texts at Baylor University. He works at the intersection of theology, ethics, race, and economics. His work is both academically rigorous and focused on the life of the church. He's deeply concerned about the quality of the church's public life and witness. His book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, Oxford 2021, argues that our economic system positions Asian Americans uniquely within the U.S. racial landscape, often as a model minority that serves the interests of white supremacy while obscuring deeper racial inequalities. In the book, Tran also argues for reimagining Christian community in ways that resist the logic of racial capitalism and promote solidarity, justice, and human flourishing for all racialized groups. Dr. Eric Gregory earned his PhD at Yale University and is currently professor of religion at Princeton University. His work engages the intersection of theology, ethics, and political theory. He's deeply concerned with the ways in which the Christian faith shapes our understanding of moral responsibility. And Eric is the only speaker on our conference agenda that's not currently teaching at a Christian college. So for this reason, he offers a unique perspective on the ways Christian faith shapes or should shape higher education. His book, Politics in the Order of Love, An Augustinian Ethic of Democratic Citizenship, University of Chicago Press, 2010, uses the thought of Augustine to offer a constructive theological argument for Christian participation in liberal democratic societies. Please welcome our speakers.
Sorry, I looked over at Eric, he's wearing a tie. And I thought I should wear...
I've never seen Jonathan put one on. I'm not sure he knows what he's doing.
Eric and I thought it would be really fun to have a conversation with each other and then you all about what it's like to try to teach and administer goodness at our respective institutions. One, a thoroughly religious institution, Baylor, and one, I don't know, is Princeton a thoroughly not religious institution?
I'll talk about that.
Okay, Princeton University. So Eric's gonna do his thing for a few minutes, I'm gonna do my thing, and then we're just gonna talk to each other and open it up to y'all. So, Eric.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're gonna give some remarks and then have a counterfactual moment of imagining what it would be like to teach at each other's institutions and then just have this conversation flow. So friends, it is a delight to be here. Thanks to the organizers in Whitworth for your great hospitality. I appreciated in that introduction that I'm not currently teaching at a institution of Christian higher ed. So I'm an outsider to the world of Christian higher ed. Princeton may have once counted in that world, perhaps not as long ago as some research institutions. I was thinking about that during Jamie's talk last night of the lost world of mainline Protestant universities. Princeton has always had more Christian students than most Ivy League schools. We were the Southern Ivy, but it would take a capacious understanding of common grace to include Princeton among Christian higher ed now. Although I did notice walking into the chapel last night for that wonderful concert, it was the Sealy Mudd Chapel. There's a Sealy Mudd library at Princeton, and it's the same person. So that world of mainline Protestantism was not so long ago and has deep connections, I think, to a big tent understanding of Christian higher ed. In any case, thanks for grafting this Gentile onto the Israel of Christian faith and learning. So Jonathan's teacher, Stanley Hauerwas, opens The Peaceable Kingdom with the claim that all ethical reflection occurs relative to a particular time and place. I teach a lot of Hauerwas, and the students all read it as relativism. Right? But I've often imagined what it might be like, not just to be a Christian in higher ed or teaching Christian students, but actually in Christian higher education. And so this is a chance to be in conversation with my friend Jonathan to do some more imagining. Can the University Make You Good was the title assigned to us, I should say. And the Augustinian response is universities can make you bad. That's the easy part. We can do the tragic. I sometimes shame my secular critical colleagues that their dour pessimism pales in comparison to the Christian tradition. They live in Disneyland when all they have is Camus and Sartre, the bleakness of Augustine. But at the same time, as we heard in Jamie's talk, there is a hope and maybe even imagination that despite the loss of Protestant hegemony in America, that we might live in the early church. For me, the intellectual life, like for Augustine, can be a form of prayer itself. And God does everything, but higher education has been a means of grace, a gathering of friends seeking the good, true, and the beautiful. It's a rare medieval institution that was built by our Christian ancestors that we are called to steward. I'm going to say a little bit about myself and experiencing it teaching. Now, scholars of Augustine know the tricks of autobiography. He practically invented the genre. His stylized autobiography, Confessions, was an invitation to read ourselves, to interrogate our inner desires, and it's a narrative that accents the brokenness of the human condition, but in some ways I think often underappreciated is also framed by the vanity of careerist efforts to overcome that brokenness. It tells the story of his leaving a fancy academic post in order to seek a higher wisdom, given the fragile state of the humanities in his ancient context. My fundamentalist Baptist great-grandmother channeled her inner Augustine when she tried to persuade me not to go to Harvard for college. I was to go to Wheaton, Calvin, Baylor, or Gordon, where every member of my family, extended family, had gone. She feared for my soul, given the perceived harm of secular learning. I resisted her counsel, which is hard to do because she was quite a force of personality. I remember when she was dying, I went to the nursing home where she was in Providence, and the very nice chaplain, who I think went to Yale Divinity School, took me aside and said, "Your great-grandmother's a firecracker." Every time I give a sermon, she comes up to me and says, "You need to preach hell. These people are about to die. They need Jesus." But for a kid from suburban Washington, D.C., the other Washington, a public school grad, Harvard opened a world of wonder to me. Sort of like plundering the Egyptians with the belief all truth is God's truth. And after a very unsuccessful foray into physics, I found an academic home with a remarkable circle of philosophers and political theorists doing battle for my soul, at least politically and philosophically. Freedom or virtue, liberty or equality, democracy or aristocracy, Plato or Aristotle, Locke or Strauss. But I never imagined an academic career, let alone in religious studies. But God had other plans. A few years at Oxford, immersed in British evangelicalism, reading Kierkegaard and Augustine, and learning the church didn't start with Hudson Taylor's mission to China, as I had thought, dashed my father's hope for a political career. So I went to Yale for a PhD in religious studies, a field that is surprisingly, in many places, hostile to Christian faith, and probably the discipline that has the fewest Christians relative to the growth of Christian scholarship in areas like philosophy, literature, and politics. Mark Knoll and George Marsden were invoked. Jamie, I think I was part of that world inspired by the outrageous idea of Christian scholarship, and the Pew Charitable Trust that built an infrastructure of, at my time, graduate students in different disciplines. But I always said to Marsden, it's funny, you don't allow people from religious studies because you assume it's a populated field with Christians. But it's sort of one of the ironies is that I think I might teach the only course in Christian ethics at a secular university. I began teaching at Princeton 2 days after 9/11 with a course on religion and violence in the modern world. And like Augustine's shattered world after the fall of Rome, my academic life began when all sorts of cultural ideals were in flux. I dove into teaching and writing in the university, and I turned that small course on Christian ethics, which is a remnant of Princeton's past, into a large lecture course. Princeton is not a big empire, so I also developed relationships with colleagues across the humanities and sciences, and I recently stepped down as chair of the humanities, a position that coincided with various curricular reforms, but also a global pandemic and campus unrest. I think we'll get to some administrative questions. Princeton is awash in ethics. We have a Center for Human Values. Many of the opening and closing sessions are encouraging students with an ethical vision. Good things like tolerance and service, but kind of thin gruel compared to my imagination for the sorts of things that Jamie was talking about that Christian colleges can do. And in my role as chair of the humanities, my main goal was to keep the old left and the new left together with a few conservatives, okay? It also coincided with renewed anxieties across campus about the humanities, even at Blessed Princeton, which has always been seen as a keeper of the flame of the liberal arts, but now many of my colleagues fear that we're becoming Stanford and MIT. So there's large questions about what the university is for right now on my campus. On Monday, I'm going back to a pretty intense faculty meeting about institutional neutrality and whether the university should make statements about moral and political issues. And maybe that might come up in our conversation as well. Higher ed has become a marker for political division, ostensibly between the super woke and the super MAGA. It hasn't been a kind year, certainly for Ivy League presidents, and attacks on the ideology of the woke academy, snowflake students drunk on identity politics, what have you. But if you Google the humanities, you also see a lot of lament about a lost curricular unity, about programs being cut, about the supposed pre-professionalism of students, a concern that universities, secular universities I'm talking about, have lost their connection to deep traditions of inquiry. You also see stirring calls for now more than ever. Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times often writes that civilization is not built just on microchips, but the humanities. The humanities humanize us. They promise a self-transformation. Plus, for good measure, humanists are cheap. I always remind our president that we are a wise investment and we're not that cheap, as I see the new science buildings coming up all across campus. We still ask big questions at Princeton about freedom, about beauty, about truth, about human desire, even about God. In fact, there is a flowering of Christian intellectual life at Princeton. For a long time, the only really out Christian faculty were Cornell West and Robbie George and myself. So I had all of Christendom sort of between low church liberation theology and new natural law Thomism, right? But now we have lots of Christian faculty, many of whom are graduates of Christian colleges, perhaps jaded from that experience, and I'm not sure they're ex-evangelicals, but they need some encouragement, or at least I try to encourage them to take on the role of being a Christian faculty member, mainly so I'm not the only one who has to go to the Friday night worship sessions and give a talk. But in my context, Princeton is so secular, it's not threatened by the Christian presence on campus. And some suggest we now live in a post-secular society that's beyond the religious secular division that fueled a kind of militant atheism that may have been once true on elite campuses, but in my experience is pretty rare these days. On the one hand, there is more openness to wonder and curiosity given the alienation from a world that has become so disenchanted and angry. That there's an openness to the mystery of God, spirituality, or at least beliefs that involve existential commitments. I had a wonderful conversation a couple of weeks ago with a student come to my office and say, "What was that thing you mentioned, the parable of the Good Samaritan? I didn't catch it. How does the story end?" And I did an event with a visiting colleague from Australian philosophy, a really top-notch philosopher, who is so illiterate about Christianity that I felt like I was on Mars Hill. He was sort of, "Who is this God you're talking about?" But no anxiety about talking about it, right? So there is a kind of refreshingness to a secularity that is not hostile to the Christian faith. Ironically, when I give talks at Southern schools, sometimes I feel they think because I'm coming from Princeton, I must be on their side against the Christian community. But I think in some ways maybe it's an openness. But also, and this is the other paradox, maybe an indifference. That we have moved beyond the Christian legacy that is still apparent in some streams of humanism that thought of themselves as secular in a different sense than Augustine, but now have lost their confidence, even in the Kantian Hegelian project. And now we live in this immanent frame that Charles Taylor talks about. So post-secular, but also post-Christian. And in one ways, maybe we could think about what is the difference between those two things. And the post-Christian part might even paradoxically be a renewed paganism. Okay? I have great colleagues. I teach a lot with a colleague, Peter Singer, who is perhaps infamous because of his views. In his teaching, though, he changes people's lives. I mean, maybe not for the good, but I think it's not true of many disciplines. And his pedagogy is not just to be a studious, liberal, neutral observer and teach the disagreements, which is how I was trained to teach and how I did teach for a few years. But now I've come to adopt a much more confessional approach, just to kind of give witness to the students of a certain point of view, after I've built up trust in the classroom that their grade doesn't depend on that. Well, I don't want to go on too long, but let me just say the vulnerable state of the humanities is an ancient theme, as I mentioned about Augustine and his frustrations with classical education. And he was a master of unmasking the lies of the Roman universities, the first master of suspicion. But his sermons are full of encouragement. Like other Christians, early Christians like Irenaeus, he thought the glory of the Lord is a human being fully alive. And he gave Christianity a new vocabulary, something to live for, not just stand against, and not just a sin story of a journey of fall to cross, but a large story of creation to the last day. And his story tried to help us escape our desire for privacy. We've heard a lot of theme of community so far. Unlike Plato, who thought philosophy was about becoming the ideal lover, he thought philosophy was about becoming the ideal beloved and learning the vulnerability that allows us to open our hearts and minds to one another. He was a spiritual sinker. He lived in a world that was haunted by the greatness of the past, but he wanted to give a new sacramental vision for the promise of a future that's already begun in Christ. So I tend to take a bigger perspective. The humanities have always been in crisis, but always resilient. Maybe that's my inner Calvinist. We live in a good world gone bad, but still retains the longing for transcendence. Princeton reorganized its curriculum in the 1950s, even then, to try to correct what was perceived as an imbalance between the sciences and the humanities. They created a humanities program that was meant to, quote, convey the ultimate meaning of life to students. That's quite an ambition, I think an excessive one, and probably is a sign of the declining influence of Christianity and the hope that universities would replace the church as the conscience of the nation, as Richard Rorty put it. A few years ago, my son at Bring Your Parents to Work Day said, Mommy's a doctor, she makes people feel better. Dad is a humanities professor. Long pause. He takes things out of Amazon boxes so that I can play with them. the humanities in the abstract is a very difficult concept. But at the risk of pride, I think he understood that the hope of the humanities is that, whether it's looking to the past, reading a great book, arguing about art, we share in a hope that we can be initiated into the longue durée of traditions, that we can get beyond the impasse of our age. I'm a realist about universities. They exist for multiple purposes. They exist to give toolkits and skills for citizens, for employees. I think one of the things we might want to think about, especially because a lot of my colleagues mistakenly lecture as if everybody in the room is a future professor. But I know, most of my students are not going to become academics. Right? And at Princeton, they're mostly going into the professions. Right? And so I think questions about vocation and formation that integrates professionalism and the Christian vision would be interesting for me to think about, especially as our university we just started a new entrepreneurship program. We have one of our most popular courses is on business ethics and how to work in the workplace without losing your soul is the subtitle of the class. Okay? Anyway, I could go on, but let me just mention two things I've noticed over the past 25 years of teaching. In the past, it was remarkable, some of my colleagues, secular colleagues who knew my Christian convictions would say to me, almost whispering, "Eric, thank God for all the Christian students at Princeton. They're so countercultural. They care about books. They care about ideas. They're not captive to the conventional wisdom of the left and the right." Now, some still say that, but there's been a subtle shift. Augustine is largely responsible for making Christianity a bookish religion, right? And I tell my students to think of my class as like a foreign language requirement, because most of them, even though there's a lot of Christians, they're a small minority on campus, most of them just have no exposure, okay? And for me, church, when I grew up, was an intellectual nursery for my soul, right? It exposed me to debates that I never had encountered in my public school education. And a lot of my teaching is about the diversity of the Christian tradition, the relationship between Christianity and its contested relationship with a lot of secular philosophy. Now, not every Christian needs to be a theologian to stay Christian, although I think Stanley Hauerwas says he had to be a theologian to stay Christian. And books are not the only form of discipleship. If anything, I think we live in a context where it's the arts rather than books or even preaching where people encounter the gospel. But it's a different world than the evangelicalism I grew up in. When nerdy Christians like me, we read C.S. Lewis and John Stott and R.C. Sproul and Josh McDowell, even Augustine, Calvin, and Luther, and it gave me insight into a broader world. But that world doesn't sing to my Christian students anymore. Okay? I don't want to sound like a grumpy professor, but the reading capacity and interest in Bible and doctrinal theology has radically declined. And they are digital natives in ways that I don't think universities or churches have reckoned with. Okay? Last week, I think the Atlantic had an article, elite college students who can't read books. Right? I had dinner with a group of the leaders of the Princeton Christian Fellowships this past week. They're amazing students. They're smart, they're empathetic, they're winsome, which I know is a term of abuse in some evangelical circles, but they're earnest followers of Christ. And in one sense, they read all the time, they're scrolling, but when I asked them, what Christian authors do you read? There was silence. And then one of them struggled to come up with Tim Keller. Another said C.S. Lewis, but then was reminded by another student that's only because I had assigned C.S. Lewis on capital punishment. They listen to a lot of pastors on YouTube. I'm pretty distant from the evangelical world, but they name J.D. Greear and Francis Chan. They're pretty biblically and theologically illiterate. And I tell them they're the closest thing to a Christian intellectual that their churches probably, or people might ever meet. So they should learn some theology and help their churches. Okay? They're not enamored of Christian apologetics, the stuff of my reformed evangelical sublime. Okay? But it has been argued that some of that apologetics came at a cost, a kind of rationalist, intellectualist, imperial view of Christianity as competing worldviews, where if you don't agree with the Christian tradition, your head will explode. Okay? A kind of weaponized culture war. My students are the furthest thing from culture warriors. One of the reasons they run from the label evangelical, the Princeton Evangelical Fellowship just changed its name to the Princeton Christian Fellowship. Right? They're more attracted to visions of beauty, I think, than truth. In part, they face a world at least at Princeton, where it's not hostile to the truth claims of Christianity, it's hostile to the goodness of Christianity. Christianity is not so much false. The main question they get is, do you support Trump? Right? Civility used to be, I'm right, you are wrong. Now it's, I'm right, you are bad. Okay? And Christianity is associated with all sorts of bads. Okay? Even as I said, there's a curiosity, because they're so distant from the Christian faith, and they know its cultural influence, that a lot of my secular students are attracted to its strangeness, especially because they have very few narratives to help shape their life. Okay? We heard about this is a very lonely, anxious, depressed COVID generation. And they're hungry for authentic relationships and narratives. One other quick thing, and then I'm going to turn it over. Another shift, and it's not just among the Christians, and I hinted at this in my question, is I never had idealists at Princeton, but they were earnest. But the past few years of our fraught social life has created a sense of despair and polarization. They don't have a story that helps them find a place in the world, or if they did, it's the myth of Sisyphus. It's not Prometheus anymore. It's really hard to find Pelagians these days. There's not many children of the light in Niebuhr's sense. They're really good at criticism, okay? Some of that is a response to the rise of a politically captive Christian identity, or maybe the post-Christian world I was talking about. But also there is a kind of space for confident pluralism. The evangelicalism I grew up in also thought cultural Christianity was a bad thing. A lot of my students are attracted to cultural Christianity. They think it creates a kind of institution. They kind of hunger for the infrastructure of cultural Christianity as a kind of preparatio for the gospel, okay? So I'm still hopeful. I'm an Augustinian, and I think our modern world is less explicitly Christian, but carries with it a lot of prodigal commitments, radical calls for social equality, moral outrage at historical injustice, care for the poor and the oppressed. Okay? But where do we form such people? Okay? The church, Augustine said, is groaning to give birth. And he had a very demanding vision of a God who demands everything but requires nothing of us. The Spirit will move as the Spirit moves. In the end, all is grace. And in some ways, my teaching, I take the parable of the sower as my motto. Okay? But Augustine wanted to give for an anxious culture something to live for. Okay? Let me end with a story of hope, and then I'll say in conversation how great it would be to teach at Baylor. At commencement last year, after a very difficult season on campus, I was standing alongside the head of our DEI office. I don't really know him that well, but I chaired our campus free speech committee, and for my sins, I'm chairing the student discipline committee on the protesters, and I don't know why our president keeps asking. I think it's because I'm a bridge builder, and I can do the Foucauldian Augustine, but I can also do the old school Augustine, so I get the support of all the faculty. Anyway, we were just talking, and he knew I taught in the religion department, but he also knew I had some connection to the Christian groups, which are probably the largest on any Ivy League campus. And he said, the Christians at Princeton seem the most joyful, least transactional, and most multiracial of any group on our campus. Do you think we could borrow something from what they do for our DEI programming? And I said, they believe in God. But it was like, what a witness to the Christian community. I'm just going to end it there, but it reminds me of Leslie Newbingen's claim, the greatest apologetic for the gospel is the gathered Christian community. All right. I have a very romantic vision of Baylor and Christian higher ed, but I'll save that for the dialogue.
I should start by saying how much I love Eric Gregory, my dear friend. Eric, when I was first finished with graduate school, Eric took an interest in me. I was no one. And Eric, with his very impressive pedigree, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Rhodes Scholar.
I tell the Princeton students I keep taking one step down the Ivy League. It's a cheap joke.
But Eric, one of the things I love about Eric is we usually try to see each other at the different conferences we go to, and the American Academy of Religion. I think Eric is the only person of the 10,000 people that go to the American Academy of Religion that actually has a schedule of everything he's going to go to, because he goes to so much. I mean, you're talking about a person that knows so much and finds a genuine desire to learn, a genuine interest in young scholars, emerging scholars, people he's heard of, and that's certainly been a big part of our relationship. And so it's a great privilege to be here with Eric, talking about these things, and to the Whitworth community, the president, Davey, Derek. I was here a couple years ago in this room actually, and it's still one of my warmest memories of the last few years, about the profound account of hope that this institution offers. I was marveling yesterday I don't know anything about music. I had never heard of Porter's Gate, but it was just remarkable that this really different kind of performance had drawn so many students with such great enthusiasm. And I thought that this picture itself was hope-giving. And so I'm really grateful to be here. So a couple things about me, or maybe one thing about me with 3 implications that I'll frame everything I'm going to say about Christian higher ed, and specifically about my institution, which I'll get into at some level of granularity. I was not raised Christian. I grew up out of the church, outside of Christianity for the first 20 years of my life. I had no concepts of God. In fact, when I started thinking about God was when I was in 7th grade mythology. I thought Zeus might be God because they talked about Zeus as God. That's how illiterate I was in religion. I thought Christians were, for the most part, they struck me as pretty stupid people. I remember one time I saw a guy at my high school who had a shirt on that said, "Jesus is my rock." That made no sense to me. Like, what in the world does that mean? I mean, I guess I lacked not only a religion, but also a metaphorical sensibility. When I finally became a Christian, it was in my early adulthood, probably at about age 19 or 20. 3 things about not growing up Christian that are highly determinative about how I try to, or just how I am a Christian. One, the Christianity that I was saved into wasn't gonna BS. If you're gonna be a Christian, you ought to try to do it. And this gave me a very low tolerance for a lot of the BS of Christianity. Because insofar as you change your whole life for it, you're going to try to do something with it. Secondly, I love Christianity. I love the church. I think Christianity and the church are the best things since sliced bread. It's probably because I grew up a war refugee, a person who suffered constant racism, grew up in extreme poverty, and the hope for the world that Christianity and Christians and the church and this institution and many, many people in this room exude just as a matter of course. I just find that the best thing. So you might think of me as the very opposite of an ex-evangelical. Someone who's raised in the church and is loudly on their way out. I'm loudly staying in. The third thing, and one cannot underestimate this, if your brain is hardwired to not believe in God, that is your default position. I will never get over that. My default position is always unbelief, even though I've been a Christian for 30 years now. And what that means for me is I am constantly looking for reasons for hope. And so my life in Christianity is to kind of trace out reasons to believe. Because if I don't have those reasons, if I don't have a Malcolm Foley in my life as my pastor, then I won't want to believe. So those are three things that are important about the things I'm about to say in relationship to Christian higher ed. So I'm a theologian and an ethicist and things like this, but these days I'm an associate dean and, or as I like to affectionately refer to myself as an ass dean. My true aspiration is to be Joseph Clare. Where's Joseph? So Joseph is I'm an ass dean, but he's an associate provost, which means he's an ass pro. So I'm aspiring to that position in my university just so I can have that on my business card. And so I want to talk a little bit about the experience.
We're at a real Christian college. You better watch your language, John.
So I want to talk about my institution, given some of that kind of conversion to Christianity thing. So Baylor is a university of about 15,000 students. The Honors College is about 1,500 students, so about 1/10 of the university is in the Honors College in some way. The Honors College is possessed of fabulous students. They love Jesus, and they have pretty good brains. And I find that the combination of those two things, which often presents itself in an earnestness, a kind of whimsical, a kind of wonder about the universe, is just the best possible context to teach in. I'll give you an example of the kind of work that can do. I'm teaching this semester a class on the Black intellectual tradition, and part of the discourses that we're looking at is something some of you may know, which is called Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism is an argument that anti-Blackness is built into the white mindset, that it is so much so that what anti-Blackness is not finally about, as I think people like Malcolm and I believe, about political ecologies or economies. They think it's about a libidinal economy, the pleasures of anti-Blackness, if you will. It's a very hard thing to read about. It is a very hard thing to reflect on. The other day we were talking about this in the class, and a lot of the students were, as you might imagine, raising objections, especially the white students. One of our students, Mia, who's an Asian American biracial white student, paused in the midst of what became a pretty heated conversation in the class about Afro-pessimism, and she said, I can see why we might object to this picture, that anti-Blackness is ontologically built into the white psyche. But she said, you know what, though? If I can speak theologically, that makes quite a bit of sense, given the Christian account of sin. And then she spun out a physiological argument about the epigenetics, about how the mind can be wired towards anti-Blackness in the ways of the Afro-pessimists. So not only did she make the connection to the theology, or the theology helped her make sense of the Afro-pessimism, but then she hooked the account of sin into an account of redemption in a way that allowed her to both hold the critical and the hopeful in this way. And no one asked her to do that. She just did it. So those are the kinds of students we get to be around in the Honors College. Other things that we get to do in the Honors College, Brett from TMC is here. A number of you are involved in pre-medical education at your institutions. Baylor, like many institutions, has about a third of the incoming class wants to be doctors. And like most institutions, the vast majority of those students won't become doctors. We send about 200 students to medical school a year. And in the last few years, we've been wondering about that. What are we doing? Because on the one hand, that's something an institution can hang its hat on. On the other hand, you could think about sending students to medical school as facilitating wealth among the upper middle class. And so we started asking very serious questions about the formation of pre-health and specifically pre-med students. And we began to think really hard about the way the curriculum is set up, the kinds of courses they take, like almost 60% of pre-med's classes will be in the hard sciences, Very little of that will be in the humanities. Very little of that will be even asking basic questions about things like global and population health, about issues of justice. And so we began to think about how we can dismantle the current pre-med education and build up a completely different one. And a virtue of Baylor is they went for it. Now, those of you that are involved in this kind of education know how difficult it is because you answer to kinds of metrics and processes that long predate you. But the fact that the university was up for this question and up for the work of trying to think through it, again, was a virtue of the institution. In my college, the Honors College, which is, I think, kind of the tip of the spear on the university's Christian mission and identity, I often refer to, so some of you know Baylor refers to itself as the Protestant Notre Dame. The Honors College is the Catholic Notre Dame. So, I lived on campus as Professor Barr did. I lived in the Honors Residential College for a number of years, and students were constantly converting to Catholicism because they found in Catholicism a thick account of Christian tradition and a picture of the life of the mind that they found just awe-inspiring. There's a room in the HRC called the Senior Commons Room, the SRC, and I often refer to it as the secret Catholic room because so many students converted to Catholicism in there. By the way, I once made the joke about how Baylor, is the Protestant Notre Dame, Baylor Honors College is the Catholic Notre Dame at a big event Eric and I were at, and the legendary theologian Jean Porter from Notre Dame had the first question, and she said, "Hey, I'm Jean Porter, I'm from the Protestant Baylor." Because we serve as something of the tip of the spear on the Christian identity and mission of the university, there is rich language and discourse and conversation and practices about moral formation. We take this extremely seriously. We try to imagine not simply the formation from freshman to senior year, but we try to imagine what the formations they bring in to the university and the formations that they will experience long after it. And again, a virtue of the Honors College is that we just get to do this stuff. So those are all kinds of dreamy kinds of things about being at Baylor and why I consider it a great privilege to be there. Let me talk about some of the downsides of the dreamy. And maybe the best way to get to the other side of the dreamy, is that I know a lot of you come from institutions where you are facing very significant challenges, some of which are existential in scope and scale. Institutions like some of the ones you all come from are facing or regularly implementing 10 to 12% cuts in staffing. Enrollment cliffs, as they say, questions about this department or this unit in the university or college, so on and so forth. The way I'm going to suggest you think about that in relationship to the kind of dreaminess that I talked about in terms of Baylor University, where it's almost the exact opposite. Baylor is swimming in money and making money hand over fist. It is adding to its faculty by the hundreds every year. In the last decade, we've gone from a university of about 12,000 to close to 20. We're now trending a little bit back on that intentionally so that we can make the classes increasingly elite. There's a whole science and strategy to this. When you hear that, it's going to sound to you like a dreamy place or something like I'm bragging. But what I want to suggest to you is that that's actually just the mirror image of the struggles a lot of you are walking through. And that there's a way of looking at the other side of that dreaminess in a way that will be amazingly reminiscent and resonant with a lot of where other Christian institutions of higher ed are involved. So let me offer 3 ways. So Baylor has, and I've shared this stuff with my university publicly. I was on the strategic planning group last year for our new strategic vision, and I've articulated these worries. So I don't think there's anything that I'm about to say about my university, which I dearly love. If there's a recording, please hear that part. That is particularly untoward. But 3 challenges of my institution as a Christian, an institution of Christian higher ed. And to Eric, I would say, sometimes when I think about teaching at a place like Princeton, I think the benefit of being at a Princeton, as I imagine it would be, is in some sense you don't have these 3 problems. So, and then we can get to that. The first is, at my institution, Christianity is referred to as a pillar of the institution, that we're going to be a flagship, we're trying to be a flagship place in terms of athletics, academics, but whatever other pillars there are, the Christian pillar is going to be a pillar. A question I constantly ask is that pillar, the Christianity, is that pillar load-bearing or decorative? I'm pretty sure in my local institution and in different places in the university, it's significantly load-bearing. But with Big Baylor, I'm never quite sure if it's decorative or load-bearing. Let me give you 3 examples of what load-bearing would be as, and each of these examples are ways in which Christians at Baylor imagine it to be load-bearing. One would be, it would be load-bearing insofar as we're a pious group of people. And I mean pious in the most positive sense. That people think pietistically about themselves and one another, that they treat each other kindly, that they imagine faculty meetings or the way staff are related to in deeply holy kinds of ways. That there's a kind of humanity running through our processes and protocols. I know they say niceness is not a virtue, but it's a pretty cool thing to have around. And my guess is that for some folks, the Christianity bears weight insofar as we have a lot of very nice people. A second way you could think about the Christianity bearing weight is we produce things in the world that are good for the world. As my colleagues from Baylor know, the new strategic plan is Baylor in Deeds. That the university is going to produce the kinds of research, the kinds of students, the kinds of athletic performances and cultural and artistic performances that do good for the world. So, for example, a colleague of ours produced an app that a kid can put in front of their eye and trace certain kinds of eye cancer. That's doing good in the world. And if there is a moral aspiration tied to our achievement of R1 research status, it's that the research would make an impact in the world in these positive ways. And so it could be load-bearing in that way. A third way it could be load-bearing is around questions of character. That is, as I often say, that at Baylor here, we don't care simply about where you're going, how we're going to get you there. A lot of the students in the Honors College, I could frankly not get in their way even if I tried. The question we're going to ask fundamentally is, what kind of human being will you be when you get there? Those are 3 ways that Christianity can bear weight, that the pillar of Christianity does work at Baylor University. But it is also the case that in almost all those 3 ways, there are constantly counter witnesses to whether we are doing those things. Both of my esteemed colleagues referred to some of the ways the pietistic stuff, it not only upends issues of justice, but the pietism is put in service of doing exactly that. With the question of deeds, the question I'm constantly asking is if Christianity reduces to doing good deeds in the world, how are we not simply a lesser version of Princeton University? And in a way we will never catch up. Isn't there a theological story that we're involved in that says that the world is saved in Christ, such that the primary prerogative of any Christian isn't to try to save it? Or that our attempts to do good in the world have to be tied to this larger story of redemption that propels the attempt to be good. Otherwise, right, you go to a place like Princeton, my guess is that the paralysis, some of the worries that Eric talked about earlier, my guess is the combination of going to Princeton University and being told 2 things at once. The world is going to hell in a handbasket, and you're here to save it. That's why you're at Princeton. the vision of Christianity is doing good things in the world, that's what Christianity is supposed to be about, seems to me to constantly run into the reality that the problems confronting our students are, as we describe them, though we seem to forget, larger than those students. And so how do we tell the story of the world that isn't simply a critical posture towards it that eviscerates hope as you go along? The third one about character at a Christian university like Baylor, and when you start to begin to use language like virtue and tradition like this, it's very quickly conscripted at my institution, including in the Honors College, where the picture of Christianity is tied to converting to Catholicism. That is very quickly appropriated to a culture war. That families will send their kids to Baylor precisely to flee the darkness, the utter darkness of the rest of the world. And there is a way in which the language of virtue and tradition and character simply further feeds into that. And then so what you have is not simply an elitism, but a traditioned elitism. Those are three things I constantly think about the university. And then let me close with one other challenge I think that these things often they run into, and that's the financial. As an associate dean, like a lot of the administrators in the room, I'm trained to constantly think about things like enrollment, about retention, about diversity numbers, about graduation rates and these kinds of things. It's also the case that Baylor is in a financial position of strength. But the question that constantly runs through my mind is, what do you do with that position? A lot of you are institutions where you feel like your institution is in, say, a deficit situation. The logic, though, that contributes to either of those, deficits or surplus, is a logic that does not stop living in your head just because you have surplus. In other words, once money runs the story of the institution, it never stops running the story. Even when you've achieved the metrics that you think put you beyond peril, the thinking is constant. And how we think about this question in an age where student debt has become what it is, and the really good things that Joseph was saying about why questions like return on investment, while things like job, why those things matter, and what we can honestly, with integrity, say to parents about why we're asking them to pay, in our case, $58,000 a year, when even our honor students, who often have some of the highest rates of discount in the university because of their academic backgrounds, a good number of them are graduating with debts over $100,000, which in my mind is a crippling amount of debt. What do we do with this? It's what our good friend, mine and Eric's good friend Ted Smith calls a vampire economy. An economy that keeps alive the old, us, by feeding off of the young. By cycling through an institutional model, a business model that is not sustainable long into the future. And if we check our hearts, we probably know that, but we think to ourselves, well, at least it'll last as long as my career. If you ever want to see how this goes, enter any conversation with progressive faculty about, and they're talking about justice, and they may even turn the reflexive mirror to themselves and talk about their institutions, about how it's unjust and this, that, and the other. Ask the question about the justness of their salaries and watch the room go quickly silent. And it's not simply the salaries of how much I make as a man, as Beth was saying, and its demonstrable advances compared to my female colleagues. It's the salaries of my institution that is flush with cash, and the salaries of the many of the much more gifted than me people in this room. Those questions are never raised, which might suggest to us that Ted's idea that we're living, that we're the vampire in the story, may be closer to us than we care to admit. So, just some thoughts.
Jonathan, maybe I'll just do a few popcorn things and
Yeah.
end with a question, and then we can open it up to you. Because, as I was saying, I mean, one of the great things about Augustine, I think, is he imagined Christianity in some sense as learning how to grieve well. And, I mean, tears are saturated through his work. And sometimes when I I don't go to a lot of Christian higher ed things, but I go to a lot of things on the future of the humanities, and there's a lot of grief, but not sure how to talk about it. From my perspective, I've always had this sense if I were in Christian higher ed, all of the frustrations I have would be gone, right? My dreams would be realized. And in a weird way, I was thinking about this during this talk. You're the kind of radical Reformation Anabaptist who's now running an institution. I'm the magisterial Protestant who's now the diasporic Jew and creative minority in this institution, and it's a real flip. I would miss a couple of things. I would miss Princeton's endowment. I would miss Princeton's basketball team, which would school Baylor, I think. I would miss my Jewish colleagues. I mean, I know there's Jews who teach in Christian higher education, but I teach a lot with a colleague of mine. We're teaching a course on Israel in Christian and Jewish imagination, which you can imagine is quite a year to be doing that. But I want to hone in on something that kind of Jamie said that I was going to bring up. Princeton kids are Energizer bunnies, and they're just ambitious. They jump through all the right hoops. They have so many activities that increasingly the academic part of their life is touchingly marginal to their Princeton experience. And we're becoming a very, as I said, STEM-oriented institution, which I love STEM. I mean, one of the things amazing for Princeton is we're a small liberal arts college, about 5,000 students. We're about to go to 6,000. But we also have like the top computer science department in the world, top engineering, neuroscience. We put a lot into science. And that is part of what being a liberal arts education is. But we've kind of outsourced the student lives to a massive industry of a student life resources that we can fund. And it's almost as if the faculty have made a bargain that we will just become independent contractors if you pay us a lot. Don't expect us to teach that much, although we teach a lot compared to other elite universities. And I've always wondered, and I experienced this last night when I went to that worship service, and when I think about my friends in Christian higher ed, and I think about the people I admire, like my teacher, Nicholas Wolterstorff, what kind of school formed him? My students, Joe Clare and Davey Henriksen, what kind of schools formed them in the classroom and outside the classroom? And it seems like, there was a visitor from Notre Dame, actually, speaking of Notre Dame, at Princeton a few years ago, and he said, Notre Dame wants to become Princeton. We want to become your research. I hear all these conversations. Princeton wants to learn how do we form values in our students. The problem is we have no shared story. Right? One of the students who took our Great Books course, when I was looking at the Baylor Great Text list, it's pretty similar. I've always thought if I taught at a Christian university, everybody, no matter what department they're in, is reading Dante, Flannery O'Connor, and John Paul II, right? The student took our Great Books class. He said, I really like this class, but we have no story. Or the story we tell them is there is no story. We just historicize the books. They learn a lot about it. They're super smart. But no one, in some ways, I'm not sure how I should think about this. I'm leading up to this question. It sounds like at Baylor, you can care about your students' souls as faculty.
And I can tell them that I care about their souls as a faculty member. So it's interesting the way you imagine Baylor from Princeton.
And at Baylor, I could stray deeper into the canon or question what is the... I mean, at Princeton, I teach a big class because it's hot-button moral issues. And I teach a smaller class on like theories of love in the Christian tradition, theories of justice, kind of the poetry of Christianity. I always want to do more of that. But my colleagues want me to do the hot-button issues because it's the biggest class. Whereas at Baylor, I think I could get like... I could teach Bart at Baylor. I could get out of just doing the greatest hits, right? So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that in a way that, I mean, Baylor students are not simply interested in theology and ethics for the hot button issues. they're genuinely interested in what Bart might say. So this student, Mia, that I talked about, so she went from Afro-pessimism to, what Jamie called a big energy reformed account of fallenness, but then to Augustine, and her favorite book, we talked about favorite books in the first day of class. Her favorite book is Book 9 of the Republic. I had to go look up what Book 9 was in the Republic to even know she was talking about. But it's where, Socrates through Plato is trying to imagine what a more just society is about. And so these are students that kind of get off on that kind of stuff. And the move to the Christianity is a natural move. So I haven't taught at Princeton, but I visited at Chicago a couple years ago. And Chicago is interesting, especially in relationship to a place like Princeton. So elite high school students will go to Princeton, Harvard, Yale because they want to rule the world. They'll go to the University of Chicago because they want to study a dead language.
Yeah.
And so they're elite students, and they imagine themselves in a very particular way. Well, Baylor Honors College students are often like that too. They could have gone to Princeton, but they wanted to go to a Princeton where they could think about and talk about God explicitly.
Right.
And so that's the good stuff. But I've also done the counterfactual thing where I've often thought, what would it be like to teach at Princeton? In my fantasy, I think that two constant frustrations or concerns of mine would magically disappear. One, that all of my hand-wringing about whether we are really a Christian university or whether we're just BSing would go out the window, because you all aren't pretending to do that. You've explicitly given up on that. And so sometimes I fantasize about a place like Princeton because I could have these students, I can have this experience, but I don't have to do the constant hand-wringing of a university that's kind of going between, say, different stories about itself. The other thing I often think about is the money. I want to be at an institution that has as large an endowment as Princeton University. Not because I'm so foolish to think that having that money doesn't mean there weren't more shenanigans to get it. It's just that those shenanigans happened so long ago that you can pretend they're not there. Versus the shenanigans of an aspiring university are right there in front of you.
Right.
And the only reason you would not know them is if you had to actively tell your left hand, your right hand had to constantly tell your left hand, I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so the fantasy about being at Princeton is at least the financial shenanigans that all of us are just living in right now, they fade to the background.
Right.
You just have the endowment. There's not a lot of question about how the endowment was procured or grown or these kinds of things. You just have it. And so sometimes the fantasy about being at Princeton is precisely the no hand-wringing on the Christian identity and mission and the no hand-wringing on the money.
And yeah, so the sins of the fathers only has how many generations? And so like I was, and to Princeton's credit, one of the reasons, I feel I really think it's an amazing education, but also I think it's 35% of our undergraduate class is now first-gen low income. Princeton is free if your parents make less than $150,000 a year, if you can get in. So it's the cheapest, we're cheaper than Rutgers. We are the cheapest school probably in America because we have the best financial aid. Now, interestingly, that creates a different complexion and demographic within the Christian community, and also there's a lot of pressure on those communities not to care about character formation or the humanities because they have so much economic pressure, even though they're coming out of Princeton. On the Christian identity thing, I think it's right. In some ways, and I worry about this for my soul, because in a way, as I mentioned, there's more Christian faculty. There's always been a lot of Christian faculty in the sciences, but they're pretty quiet. They're pious, but they're not interested in faith and learning. We have a group of new, younger faculty who are. But for a long time, because I was sort of the only out Christian, I was orthodoxy. I'm not Protestant. I'm a pretty traditional Christian. I'm in religious studies. I'm a very conservative theologian. But no one cares what my Christology is. They don't even care what my views on gender and sexuality are. And I've always thought in some ways I have a freedom without the anxiety of the Christian identity, but also maybe there's something good about the faculty fights your departments have to have over certain things. Plus, I get to teach whatever I want. I can teach Paul, I can teach Bart, I can teach, I have, again, a freedom because, no one thinks about the Christian identity. And theology is really chic now. I have so many colleagues in the English department coming to my office hours, even though they're scholars of medieval Renaissance poetry, and they should know this stuff. I shame them for how theologically illiterate they are. I mean, how did you get a job at Princeton teaching John Donne and you don't know Trinitarian theology? It's just like, just a secularization of the academy. But again, they're just interested in it now as intellectual history, right? But you're right, there is a freedom. Christian identity is not, and in some ways, Princeton's different than most Ivies because we don't have a divinity school, because the seminary happens to be in Princeton, but not part of the institution. There's no confusion of mission, so there's no anxiety. In some ways, that's why my religion department is very open to theology, apart from having a lot of colleagues in Jewish thought who think it's important to have a little bit of Christian thought, because the seminary is not a part of the university, and the seminary itself is going through controversies about Christian identity right now. So I think you're right, it would, but you would lose, would it be worth, that freedom worth the loss of the soul formation identity of an institution?
Yeah, I have a question about your meeting on Monday without getting into specifics, but let me just say a couple of things. So just to give you a sense of the financial difference, Baylor also has a fund, the Baylor Fund, that basically covers students if their families make under a certain amount of money. So at Princeton, it sounds like the number is 150. Baylor's is 50. Which, if you know much about higher ed, if your family makes literally less than 50,000, college is, in many cases, beyond consideration anyways. But it is our attempt as a university to be a just institution. So what we have to do instead, in the short run, is have as many students as possible so that we can bring money in through enrollment, with the goal being at some future date that as we bring make the classes bigger, and then shrink the university to be more elite, less discounted students, which I think we know the demographic on less discounted students is going to be by default. Then over time, as we have more elite students, we have a greater endowment, then we can start bringing in the students that can't pay.
Right.
That's the plan. And my guess is that for every university with a massive endowment, that was also their plan at some point too.
Yeah.
This is what I mean by the distance. But here's my question to you, Eric. And this relates to all the turmoil on your campus after October 7th last year. So Baylor, as Beth talked about, Baylor is an extraordinarily unpolitical campus. And I've tried to get my head around what this is, but it is an absolutely unpolitical campus. I often joke that it's not that Baylor went from October 6th to October 8th, just skipping over the 7th. I think we went from October 6th to October 5th. Like we actually went backwards. I used to say something like that as a kind of self-soothing kind of how I feel about the lack of politics at Baylor. But recently, I've actually felt pretty happy about that. That I think I'd rather be in a space that doesn't yield to the kind of Manichaeanism that we've seen in the last, say, year. So let me ask you, would you rather be at, after October 7th, would you have rather been at Princeton with all the challenges that's come up, or would you rather be at a place that went from October 6th to October 5th?
Well, let's just agree we would not want to be at Columbia. And in a way, I'll put it this way. I mean, I have, in some ways, my romantic vision of the university is I'm a little attracted to Stanley Fish's idea that, save the world on your own time. And for our undergrads, Princeton is this bucolic, precious community with a huge endowment where for 4 years they can build their intellectual, moral, and even spiritual capital, and then go off, right? Now, granted, most of them go off to McKinsey, Goldman, or what have you. Not so much anymore. Those are like for safe students. Now they want to go into like tech and change things. And I mean, the best class I did 2 years ago was with a colleague in computer science, where the course was designed, like how to create apps when you show up at landmarks around America that have religious histories, and the app would like give you the religious history of the place. And it was like a fun way to join the sciences and the humanities. Just a pitch so I'm not anti-science. But Princeton's never been an activist place, but it's become an activist place. I mean, it was partly post-George Floyd, but really after October 7th, for all the reasons you all know, because we have a fairly sizable Jewish population, many of which are active in the protests against Israel. And then interestingly, we have a very new left faculty and student body that have been, took over student campus buildings, all the chanting, everything. But what I'll say is the rabbi asked me the other day, where are the Christians? And I sort of said, well, he said, I thought all Christians were Zionists. And I said, let's have a talk about the mainline Protestant church, but also the Christians are there to support and pray the Christian undergrads. They're pretty apolitical too. The protests were being led by Princeton Theological Seminary students alongside elite black faculty, which also created a racial dynamic because they took over a building that was populated by white, lower middle class staff. And it was an intersectional mess, and it's still being, adjudicated in the criminal courts. The one thing I'll say, this isn't being recorded, right? Our president, who I tend to really like, he's very juridical. I told him we need a pastor, we need a president, we need somebody who can heal our community. So on the one hand, I like the renewed sense of activism and engagement with the world. I just personally happen to not agree with a lot of this faculty meeting on Monday is for boycotting Israel. It's for sanctioning, not calling it whatever our president calls it, the conflict in the Middle East, but to call it the genocide. It's for not punishing the students who took over the campus building, who, also disrupted the university in other ways. So yes, it's been a mess, but in another sense, I'll just end with this. It kind of reminds me of the 60s. And 60s were a moment when secular universities asked themselves again what they're for. So even though I tend to be on the institutional neutrality side, when I was chair, I got so much flack for not issuing an anti-racism statement. Right. And it was partly, obviously, against racism. I just thought it was cheap. It's a cheap way to do things. Let's put money into actually hiring more black faculty, not just building up our DEI office, and not just giving a statement that like McDonald's could give. Plus, I think we're a diverse community, and not everybody has the same view. It put a lot of pressure on junior faculty. So I tend to think our institution should be neutral, but it's at odds with I miss the bully pulpit of universities having a kind of moral and political engagement. So I'm pretty confused. I mean, I think on the whole, I'm on the side of like universities are diverse things with a mission. We're not a political activist agency. Plus, I worry a little bit about what my colleagues would vote for, But there is a sense in which that neutrality is a kind of, let's just go on with the technocratic revolution and not worry about what values we actually do hold. But if we're back in a 60s moment, it is an opportunity to what is this university for? Who do we serve? Yeah. And so that hopefully, I'm not expecting a high watermark of public dialogue at our faculty meeting on Monday, just because it's gotten very vicious. But we sort of have, the Christians at Princeton are sounds like Baylor. But I like having I'm addicted to I think, the diversity of the secular liberal university. And that's what I worry for all my romance of the Christian Academy, I've never been a part of it, and the scholars I know who were, except for people in this room, left the faith.
Yeah, I'll say one last thing, and then we open it up to folks in the room. Last year, I was hearing a lot about fights at places like Wheaton, Calvin, SPU, along lines of what's often called ideology, things like CRT, questions of gender, sex, sexuality. One thing I want to say about that is sometimes those things only mask themselves as ideological fights. Follow the money and you're going to find that there are questions about margins. So that's one thing. But I kind of felt when I heard about this fight at Wheaton about whether they're going to allow the use of pronouns, that whole kind of thing, I kind of felt a little jealous because I wanted us to have those kinds of fights. Like, what does Christianity mean ethically and morally? Our fights are about things like, how we're going to fund the new basketball stadium. It reminded me, like, back in the day when, I don't remember where I saw this, but like in John Calvin's Geneva, they would arrest people for, improper papers, which, I thought was like, bad pictures and stuff like this. But it was like bad theology. I was like, that's a serious moral community. We don't have those as an institution. We've largely punted and said what we're going to do is fight about the kind of bottom line. So we're interested in what questions or thoughts you all have. I kind of wanted to do a secret poll after hearing me and Eric talk, like, where would you rather teach, Baylor or Princeton? But we won't do that.
We won't reveal our salaries either.
That's right.
So after this session here, we go to the breakouts, and after the breakouts, there's a bit of gap between dinner and the 7 p.m. tonight. So what we're gonna push everything back maybe about 10 minutes or so. So this will go till maybe 3:10. There's a little more space here to converse. So.
Thanks for an engaging conversation. Jonathan, you mentioned in terms of some of the aspects of you not growing up a Christian, the first thing you said was that you have a very low tolerance for BS. So appreciate that. And one of the things you talked about was that this had to be something worth it to change your life. And one of the things you also talked about, what you appreciate about Eric's circumstances at Princeton is that he doesn't have to put on a veneer of Christianity to conform. And Eric talked about not having that burden of expectation of this Christian identity. However, for a lot of people in this room who come from Lilly Network of Institutions, they do have to carry the burden of a Christian identity. And conversely, it could be a place where there could be a lot of BS about Christianity. So how do you wrestle with the fact that you want your Christian thought process and your claims to be sincere enough that there isn't a BS, that this has to be something worth it for someone to change your life, when there is an expectation of a veneer of a Christian identity?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. So if I understand the question, you're saying something like, given the way you grew up and then became Christian with this low tolerance for fakery, how do you deal with the fakery of a lot of Christianity? I don't know. I guess being raised, quote, in the world is, I never went into the church fully believing everything Christians said about themselves. And so the hypocrisy wasn't surprising. I thought the people there were people. So you'll hear these stories about Christians leaving the church because of these great disappointments they feel in the church, which I might imagine someone wanting to go to Princeton because of the great disappointment they feel with Baylor or Belmont or what have you. I often wonder, what do they think they're going to find at Princeton? They're human people too, and they fall short of their own aspirations as well. But the other thing I do is I think there's a greater measure, I hope, of humility that what I consider BS may not be. That's why I think it's important for me to acknowledge that there are three very different kinds of ways my colleagues may think Christianity is bearing weight. I may think that those are wrong, but I have to, come to terms with the very possible reality that I'm the wrong one.
Thank you so much. It's a feast. I guess I wonder if the Christian intellectual tradition and the Christian humanities has run out of gas in some way, and if maybe we're like waiting for another Augustine. It feels like the deeper you get into the Christian intellectual tradition, as it currently stands, it's like feels narrative starved in some way for a bigger story. And the evidence of the starvation is like you get to a certain point and the romance of the past turns into nostalgia, and you kind of take an end run back around modernity into a kind of traditionalism, or you sort of bottom out in a kind of endless critique or sort of pessimism potentially. And the question is like, for any great text or humanities course is like, what do you do with modernity? How do Christians make sense of modernity and move forward into some broader, exciting project and adventure for which you get caught and swept up into and called forth into a community and a life in? In some ways, I'm like, are we just waiting for another Augustine? Will this Augustine come from another North Africa outside of the current conversation in Europe and North America? Because it just feels like you go down, you do the course, you get there, and there's like two paths, people go in either direction, and it just feels sort of lamentable. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Augustine would hate it for us to think we're waiting for another Augustine, right? I mean, but I'm largely sympathetic to that. I mean, one theme that hasn't come up that I know we're all aware of that this prompts me to think about is like the globalization of Christian activities. One of my teachers, George Limbeck, also a product of Christian colleges, told me the future of Christian intellectual life is China. He just thought they had a scholasticism and a kind of growing church that would decenter the Eurocentrism of theology. One of the things Princeton's I had this Western Great Books program that looks very similar to the Great Text program. One of the things I did was, and I'm still also ambivalent about this, is created a Asian Great Books track and a Near Eastern Great Books track alongside the Western one. Although those aren't as large now, but I also encouraged some imagination because I worried it was deeply entrenching the divides, because there's a lot of Christians that should be in the Asian Great Books side of things and things like this. So I think in general, yes, like we're kind of stuck in this rut between critique and traditionalism. The best schools try to bring those two together, I think. But, you know, again, the hopefulness is the Spirit moves, and there may, you know, there is some other Augustine, but, you know, it's weird how Augustine became white, given what you said, that he's a North African. He's an African. And there is, you know, some, you know, there is a financial question here and all this sort of thing. I spent a lot of time in southern India this summer, where there's a kind of ancient Christian traditions, but a lot of resource-starved institutions. But yeah, I mean, I know Christian institutions tend to be a lot more international. I told this story at dinner tonight, but I remember when Pat Robertson gave a talk at Yale once. He disarmed the crowd by saying, you know, I know this is an amazing institution. I come from an institution where only 40% of our students are underrepresented minorities, because it was such an international student body, right? So Christian institutions, I tell my secular colleagues, Christians have a very international perspective. Right? So that's another strength that Christian colleges have that they could draw into in the kind of the different cultural, intellectual traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say Christianity is in a position to save the humanities.
Yeah.
Just like Islam has great resources to save the humanities. Judaism, we are people of books, of the book. We have built into our lives critique tied to love and, you know, what my colleague Natalie Carnes calls attunement. The big post-critique movement in literary studies is the idea that, okay, I love this poem, I realize the writer was a patriarchal a-hole, but I still love the poem. What do I do with that? What do we do with our basic attunements to the world? There's an ontological picture that Christianity gives us that allows us to hold the critical work of the humanities tied to its aspirations for the human.
Who do Baylor students read? I mean, apart from the great books, like, do they read Christian stuff the way, like, you know, you grew up as a non-Christian, like Augustine, probably the only early church father who was a non-Christian for most of his life. But, I grew up in this world where there are always like these Christian intellectual, kind of in the space between Max Lucado and university press books. But do Baylor students read outside the curriculum?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd be interested in what my colleagues say about this. There's still
They probably still read C.S. Lewis or something like that, right?
C.S. Lewis is huge. Tolkien is huge. So these kids are like massively literate in the quote tradition. But they're just kids who love books. Like, so this story that we floated around about kids not reading books anymore, the students I read more books than, many of their faculty do. So, in the honors college. I mean, there are other parts of the university that are incredibly, so other parts of the university are incredibly illiterate in the same way that your student talked about not knowing how the Good Samaritan story ends. So, as you're getting to the next person, this kind of moment, and this, I think, part of what Joseph's talking about, the moment of decadence when what we draw from the humanities is simply the critical posture, is probably the death knell that it's coming to an end. So then the question is going to be, the new Augustine or whatever is going to give a resurgence of the interest and the integrity of the human. A person that's doing this in a completely non-religious way, but he learned this by being swallowed up in the identity politics of Yale, is Paul Gilroy. Gilroy's famous for the Black Atlantic and a number of other texts, but he then went to and he was raised in a kind of anti-racist tradition that race and class were always intertwined realities. His teacher was the great Stuart Hall. And then he went to Yale and was swallowed up in the anti-humanistic acids of critical theory. And so now he's gone back, and everything that Gilroy talks about is this new humanism. Right. It's the attempt to claim the human given our dehumanizing tendencies. And Gilroy, there's a great article in the Guardian called The Last Humanist. I encourage you to take a look at this. Sorry.
Am I up? Okay. I'm Lindsay. I'm at George Fox. This is half-baked, so sorry. First question should be an easy lob, and I should know this, but I don't. Does Baylor have a faith statement for students?
Yes, do we have a faith statement?
That students sign?
No, but
okay.
There is something for faculty.
Sure. Sounds like your title was also given to you for your topic today. Is that true? Okay. Well, when I read it, was it faith formation, or wait, no.
Can the university
make you good? It made me think of that really weirdo passage in 1 Corinthians 6 about the guy who's sleeping with his stepmom. Do you remember this? And no one? Well, okay, so it's the story where this guy is sleeping with his stepmom, and Paul's aghast about it, and so he comes out and he's like, hey, you really got to stop this. And actually, he tells them that they have to kick him out. And he gives this image, right, of like a little yeast doing its thing. And if they let this go, who are they? And he does that great Paul thing of like, you are, so be. Like, you are the body of Christ, so act like it. So it's identity before act. But his recommendation to them, so it's weirdo that he's sleeping with his stepmom. It's also really strange that Paul's advice is to kick him out so that he would be brought back, like that his soul would be saved, because it's the church. The church is his home, the church is his medicine, the church is what would keep him alive. And I guess so it's like a strange way to think about, because this guy claimed to be a Christian and yet was acting in such a profoundly anti-Christian way, that Paul recommends kicking him out so that he would be better formed to return. And I guess I work at a school that feels pretty Christian, and is, but we don't require our students to sign a faith statement. Not that I think that places who have students have to sign that like they magically are, or they're deeply committed to their faith. But there's this sense of like expectation of, do we say we when we talk about what we believe? I actually really love that I don't get to pretend or assume that the people I'm talking with believe anything that I'm saying. But it does make me wonder what kind of formation I'm warranted to ask and expect of them when they have not signed up as a student. They don't identify as being a part of this church, but they are a part of this school. And so I start thinking about like, well, and this is why it's half-baked, I don't know how to land this plane. Paul's advice seems awful but helpful in that scenario. I struggle sometimes to think about what good formation would look like in a university that smells and tastes and talks and walks a whole lot like Christ, but doesn't necessarily expect that of their students. I don't really know sometimes. I think there's some real benefits that come from that. I really feel like I'm on mission in a really great way. But it also feels like, come on, you didn't sign up for this. So what am I really asking you to do? Or become? It's half-baked. Take it however you want.
What expectations do you have of your students?
Well, I was saying, I mean, Jamie mentioned ritual. Princeton's really good at ritual, right? Durkheim said religion is the community worshiping itself, and Princeton is very Durkheimian. Like, it's a very pro-Princeton. The students are not alienated and ironic about the institution the way my experience at Yale and Harvard was. And part of the reason we have a big endowment is because they create all these things that create identity and allegiance to the institution. So we don't have a faith statement, but we basically indoctrinate our students into the Princeton way of life. And, you know, some of that has to do with an honor code, some of that. So there are expectations, and increasingly it's about learning to disagree with each other. Like, we have all these consultants leading these sessions and things like that. But it's a very shrill campus right now, which it hasn't been. And so the whole question of what is heterodox and what is orthodox, in a weird way, is now hitting the religion. And because Princeton doesn't really know what the scriptures are of its religion, it's not sure what the boundaries are of what's in and what's out. So there is a kind of expectation of what would be unbecoming of a Princeton student. And most of it has to do with like the virtues of liberal democracy. So fairly shallow, but fairly demanding at the same time. But we don't have again, maybe like I mentioned, the freedom I have of not being in a place where, I mean, I could probably sign most faith statements that I've read at most Christian colleges. But yeah, the expectations increasingly are virtues that I think secular universities don't know how to talk about. Protestants for a long time didn't know how to talk about virtues, like, because virtues were like a Catholic thing, right? And it worries about works righteousness. But there is a kind of, it'd be interesting to see like what you can demand of your students. I mean, sometimes I think I demand too little of my students, partly because they think I grade too hard and I give too much reading. But I think sometimes we underestimate them. We should expect more of them.
I have really high expectations of our students, regardless of whether they're Christian. I don't know what it means, as several of the comments, I don't know what it means when they say they've been raised Christian. It could be really great or not great. But in the classroom and the relationships with the kids I play basketball with every day, or the expectations I have, I want to put those as high as possible and call them to something greater.
The one thing, again, just to echo the point, what Christian colleges expect is a holism. That at Princeton, I get the holism for the Christian students who come to my office hours, but in my class, it's just teaching my class. It's holistic in the sense the humanities are, but there's not this integrated life that the Christian colleges seem to have.
There was a moment in the Black intellectual tradition class where a lot of students raised objections to someone we read. And at the end I said, hey y'all, in this class, and if you are interested in something called the life of the mind, your first response should never be, I don't agree. It should be, how do I understand?
Right.
And if you don't have that as a posture in this class, then you lack in intellectual virtue. It's also not particularly smart to think that way. And then I'll tie it to the Christianity. That's stuff we can do. My experience is that students don't run from that. I think students want to imagine themselves in a story. I mean, it's similar to what Eric was saying about our students these days. The default position is a one of hopelessness. My thought about why you go work for the hedge fund is because that's the biggest dream that you've been given. And I think students, put a picture in front of them about the good life, like calling our students, hey, is it really the case that you're going to graduate from the top medical school and the dream that you've always had was to become a dermatologist because the starting salary is $370,000 and you work 9 to 5? My guess is that's not what drove you to medicine in the first place. And by calling that out, I find that students step into that. And I'm willing to err on the side of the bigger aspiration. If students are put off by it, that's fine. It's a self-selecting university. There's 15,000 people. They can avoid me like the plague, and I'm sure many do. But in the short time we have with students, I want to put Christian, Muslim, atheist, the biggest aspiration of the best possible life they could have. And hope that they choose into that. I never want to compromise. The moment I compromise on those hopes and expectations, I'm taking up space in the classroom. They deserve better.
I definitely increasingly grown to appreciate what the Paul body of Christ diversity is, and I'm Reformed, so I have a strong doctrine of vocation. So my students will pursue many vocations. And again, as I said, I worry sometimes academics have this like idealized idol of the academic life. So recognizing they're going into all sorts of positions. We could have a late market capitalism disagreement right here, but they're going into professions. But not to do that just because it's easy. That's what I worry. I mean, at Princeton, it's easy because they come and offer you lots of money. And these kids who grew up in families where they didn't even know what a management consultant was, and now all of a sudden it's their dream job, just because it's made easy. So that I share that, like, you know, trying to open a world to them of a life, you know, that has a greater aspiration.
Join me in thanking Eric and Jonathan. So according to the book, we're now 11 minutes behind schedule. So rush off now to the breakout session. And like I said, we can bump the breakout sessions back a good 10 or 15 minutes on the back end of those because we have some space between that and dinner. And then the next thing scheduled after the breakout sessions is a panel with all the plenary speakers at 7 p.m., but that will be over in the chapel. So we'll all be together at 7 p.m. over in the chapel. All right, go in peace.